Just imagine if someone revealed to you that before Eve ever appeared, Adam once had another wife. A woman not formed from a rib, but from black dust and the soul of fire. Her name was Lilith. And she, not Eve, was the first woman of humanity carrying within her a rebellious bloodline and refusing to submit to anyone, not even her husband and not even the God who created her. Adam shouted,
"You are the female. You must submit to the law of heaven."
Lilith laughed in scorn, her eyes blazing red.
"I will not submit to a weak one. If heaven is a chain, then I would rather choose the curse of the abyss."
The moment her words ended, vast black wings burst from her back, and Lilith soared straight out of the Garden of Eden forever, leaving behind a stunned Adam in a heaven she saw as a radiant prison. She chose to exile herself to the cold and shadowed wilderness of the Red Sea. At the farthest edge of this world, Lilith joined herself to the fallen angels, the Watchers, and gave birth to a rebellious lineage, the Nephilim and the Lilim beings of supernatural power. But why would such a great being, one personally endowed by God with power and beauty, choose to abandon everything and become a bloodthirsty demon queen? Why was the name Lilith completely erased from the official Bible, surviving only in the forbidden ancient scrolls of Enoch and in the mystical traditions of Jewish mysticism? Welcome to a story that has been forbidden for more than 3,000 years. In today's video, we will reopen the oldest ancient scrolls cast out of doctrine, descend into the underworld of the Sitra Achra, ruled by a council of 4 demon queens, and together unravel the most shocking mystery of all. Lilith, was she truly the mother of the Nephilim? Before we begin, if you are new here and find these kinds of explorations meaningful, please consider subscribing to the channel so we can meet again on future journeys. I truly appreciate your presence here. As always, I would love to know where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. Those small details help me feel the connection of our community across the world. And now, without making you wait any longer, let us begin our exploration. Lilith, the first woman of humanity. Long before the stories we have known by heart since childhood, there was another name often spoken only in whispers through the dark Lilith. She is not a biblical figure in the ordinary way most people imagine. In fact, her presence appears only once in a single faint and passing reference. And yet, over hundreds of years of retelling the legend surrounding her expanded into something both vast and terrifying. At first, she was a common female demon across many Middle Eastern cultures, appearing in the book of Isaiah, the Babylonian Talmud, and incantation bowls from ancient Iraq and Iran. She also appears in Kabbalah as an evil reflection of the feminine aspect of God alongside Samael. Jewish feminists, drawn to her insistence on equality, later reclaimed Lilith as a symbol of autonomy and independence. But perhaps the most famous story about her comes from a medieval Jewish document called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, compiled sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries. This is an anonymous medieval text inspired by the wisdom of Sirach. It is generally dated to around 700 to 1000 AD. It is a collection made up of 2 lists of proverbs, 22 in Aramaic and 22 in Hebrew, both arranged as acrostics following the letters of the alphabet. Each proverb is accompanied by a Haggadic commentary. In this narrative, Lilith appears as Adam's first companion. She was formed from the very same earth from which he was made, not drawn from a rib and not conceived afterward as a helper. She stood there proud and fully equal beside Adam. The conflict began right there in the Garden of Eden. When Adam demanded that she submit beneath his authority, Lilith refused outright. Why should she yield when both of them had been created in the same way, from the same handful of dust? The disagreement quickly escalated. Adam found that he could not endure such rebellion, and Lilith would not accept any attempt by him to impose rule over her. Then Lilith committed an act considered strictly forbidden. She uttered the holy name of God, the true name that holds power over all things. With that sacred word upon her lips, she rose into the air and fled Eden, leaving behind Adam, the garden, and every boundary that had tried to restrain her. The highest power sent 3 angels after her. They were Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangoloth, and they followed her trail all the way to the Red Sea, where she had chosen to dwell among the winds of the desert. They found her and delivered an ultimatum: return to Adam or suffer devastating consequences. That was the price of freedom. 100 of her children would die every day if she refused to come back. Without hesitation, Lilith looked directly at the angels and made the defining choice of her existence. She chose not to return, accepting the loss of her children. She chose to keep her freedom to dwell in the wild places, to give birth to demons, and to enter human homes in the night, to steal newborn children, a bitter revenge for the blood she herself had lost. That became her eternal curse. But at the same time, it also became a symbol of her power. Cast out of paradise, transformed from woman into demon. She lingered at the edges of human society, a mother of monsters, a queen of darkness, and the first one who dared to speak a refusal. Eve and the design of Plan B, the adjustment of patriarchal order. If we look deeply into records from extra-canonical texts and theological analyses of ancient Jewish tradition, we encounter a shocking hypothesis, a secret that patriarchal religious institutions have tried to conceal for thousands of years. Eve was not actually the one and only original woman. The truth is even more unsettling than that. Eve was Plan B, a substitute solution, a kind of patchwork response created to deal decisively with a rebellion Adam had utterly failed to overcome in his first wife, Lilith. To understand why such a pivotal change took place, we must travel back to the moment of the original design. Based on the text of Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, Scripture states clearly, God created man in his own image. Male and female created he them. Please pay very close attention to that phrase, he created them at the same time. In that first act of creation, God did not take anything from Adam's body in order to create Lilith. Instead, he used the same dust and formed 2 separate beings, then breathed into both of them the same divine breath. In terms of biological authorship, Lilith was Adam's perfect parallel. She did not owe him a rib, nor did she owe him a single drop of blood. Lilith stood there radiant and free, carrying within herself the full dignity of one who bore no mark of dependence. And yet, it was precisely that perfect equality of structure that became the spark for an eternal conflict. Adam, driven by an instinct to control, insisted on establishing an order of above and below. He forced Lilith into a position of submission, even in the most private moments of married life. And it was then, in the brilliance of the Garden of Eden, that Lilith spoke a sharp argument that still echoes to this day, like a declaration of freedom. Why should I lie beneath you? Why should I obey you? I am equal to you. For both of us were created from the same dust. That fierce awareness of her equal worth led Lilith to make an unimaginable decision. She chose to exile herself into the void, to leave the peace of Eden in exchange for personal freedom. That act was the complete collapse of the design of Plan A. It left behind a lonely Adam, an incomplete paradise, and a system error that the Creator now had to correct. And that is when Plan B began. To fill the void Lilith had left behind, while also ensuring that the rebellion error would never happen again, a secondary design was introduced, the creation of Eve. This time, the method of creation changed completely. Eve was no longer shaped independently from dust. She was taken from Adam's own rib while he lay in deep sleep, turning woman into an extension of the man's anatomical structure. was a deeply practical theological calculation. It permanently stripped woman of her original equal standing. Eve no longer stood independently. She bore the mark of dependence from her very first breath. She was designed to become gentle, obedient, and purely a helper, whose role was to make up for Adam's lack. You see the sequence of man first, woman second. Man from dust, woman from man became the iron foundation for arguments of power for thousands of years. It gave later apostles a basis for justifying why women were not permitted to teach or hold authority over men. In truth, throughout history, the existence of Lilith has been like a black mark in the record, one that patriarchal editors wanted erased at any cost. Because to acknowledge Lilith would mean acknowledging that male domination was not from the very beginning an eternal divine command, but rather a kind of emergency solution, a concession made in response to Adam's weakness. To protect this system, the image of Eve was elevated into the original version, the first woman. Over time, Plan B was naturalized into doctrine, allowing those in power to turn a male-dominant social order into an unquestionable cosmic command. And in doing so, they skillfully pushed aside every trace of a radiant equality between man and woman that had once existed at the very dawn of humanity. But behind that haunting demonic image, could there be another truth hidden beneath layers of time? To truly understand why Lilith became so terrifying, we have to look more deeply into the roots of the fear that shaped her. According to the research, the writers of the alphabet of Ben Sira did not invent Lilith. They were simply retelling an ancient obsession that had existed long before them. They skillfully wove together primal fears that had already been rooted in human consciousness for thousands of years before Judaism ever appeared. Let us travel back to the earliest cities of mankind in Mesopotamia, where the light of torches was never enough to drive back the vast darkness of the desert. The essence of Lilith carries the atmosphere of the demons that once terrified the first agricultural peoples. In a world where medicine was little more than prayer, the sudden death of an infant or the loss of a mother in childbirth was not merely a tragedy. It was the presence of a cruel source, supernatural force. She represented something deeply basic and ancient, the fear of what human beings cannot control. When medieval Jewish scholars systematized her story, they were in truth trying to give a name to anxieties that had already existed since the Bronze Age. They turned an invisible dark force into a figure with a human shape, a story, and a reason to hate. In this way, Lilith was no longer just a demon wandering through the desert wind, but became an early psychological portrait of rebellion and of the dangers tied to family life. In truth, for ancient communities, giving pain a name and a face like Lilith was one way of confronting hardships that offered no explanation. By assigning tragedy a form, they felt a little less helpless before a brutal fate, no matter how frightening that name might be. It eased the invisible terror of unbearable losses, the death of a mother in childbirth, or the crushing grief of a newborn who suddenly stopped breathing in the night for reasons medicine at that time could not explain. It also reflected society's fear of desires beyond control and its unease toward women bold enough to reject the roles already assigned to them. By placing Lilith in the role of Adam's first wife, the ancient storytellers wove an origin story for all of these fears. They turned mysterious events into a narrative with a beginning and an end. Now they had answers for their most painful questions. Why do infants sometimes pass away forever in their sleep? Why do women sometimes turn away from the role society expects of them? And why do men sometimes wake in shock from strange dreams they cannot name? The power of this myth lies in its simplicity. One moment of defiance, one powerful utterance, and one flight straight toward freedom. With only those three actions, a woman became the eternal adversary of traditional family order. From that moment on, the name Lilith came to represent everything that threatened the household and the fragile boundaries that keep society stable. Her offspring later inherited that same legacy in full. Every being she brought forth in the arid wilderness carried the same unyielding blood as their mother. They slipped into the night, searching for the hidden cracks in the human soul. Reminding us of one thing, the forces we fear most sometimes wear a shape disturbingly close to our own, because in truth they too were once human. The story of Lilith's descendants begins with that fateful choice. Her refusal opened a separate path for thousands of shadowy beings that would come after her. It was a rift between two worlds, where her children would forever move between the world of man and the world of spirit, yet permanently belong to neither. However, if we set aside the oral legends for a moment and go looking for specific historical evidence, you will see that the figure of Lilith is actually a convergence of many layers of ancient fear. From a textual standpoint, Lilith as an individual, Adam's first wife, was first made known to the world through the alphabet of Ben Sira. This is a work from the 8th century, marked strongly by satire and at times by the misogyny of that era. And yet the term Lilith, as a race of demons that included both male and female forms, had truly existed and haunted humanity for several thousand years before that. Even in the Bible, Lilith is mentioned only once as a solitary desert dweller, described in Isaiah chapter 34. Come near, ye nations, to hear, and hearken, ye people, let the earth hear, and all that is therein, the world and all things that come forth of it. For the indignation of the Lord is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them. He hath delivered them to the slaughter. Their slain also shall be cast out, and their stink shall come up out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood, and all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their host shall fall down as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea, and upon the people of my curse to judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. And the unicorn shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of recompenses for the controversy of Zion. And the streams thereof shall be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone, and the land thereof shall become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night nor day. The smoke thereof shall go up forever. From generation to generation it shall lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. But the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it. The owl also and the raven shall dwell in it, and he shall stretch out upon it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. They shall call the nobles thereof to the kingdom, but none shall be there, and all her princes shall be nothing. And thorns shall come up in her palaces, nettles and brambles in the fortresses thereof. And it shall be an habitation of dragons and a court for owls. The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest. There shall the great owl make her nest, and lay and hatch and gather under her shadow. There shall the vultures also be gathered, every one with her mate. Seek ye out of the book of the Lord, and read no one of these shall fail. None shall want her mate, for my mouth it hath commanded, and his spirit it hath gathered them. And he hath cast the lot for them, and his hand hath divided it unto them. By line they shall possess it forever, from generation to generation shall they dwell therein. But the shadow called Lily, or Lilitu, had long already been a feared predator in ancient Babylonian religion. Researcher J.A. Skurlock offered a chilling perspective on their origin. He wrote the Lilitu, or Ardat Lily demons, crave victims because they were once human. They were the spirits of young men and women who had died too early, while their longings for love and family still remained unfinished. That longing drove them to slip secretly into people's homes, through the windows, desperately searching for substitute wives and husbands to replace the happiness they had never been able to attain in earthly life. This convergence of fear was reinforced further by Lamashtu, an exiled goddess with a horrific appetite for human flesh and blood, one who especially threatened infants. Over time, these beings gradually blended together, forming the image of Lilith that we know today, a figure with deadly beauty for men, yet also a spirit that strangles the life out of children. If you need physical proof of how deeply our ancestors truly feared this being, look to the terracotta incantation bowls, found widely in Iraq and Iran, and dated from around 400 to 800 AD. These bowls served as exorcistic tools for every community, from Jews to Christians to pagan groups. At the center of these bowls, archaeologists often found drawings of a Lilith demon, bound in chains, surrounded by incantations inscribed in Aramaic dialects. Their purpose was unmistakable: to drive this spirit out of the house and out of the body of the afflicted. The texts on these bowls accused Lilith of tormenting people through both nighttime dreams and daytime visions. She appeared to men in the form of a woman, and to women in the form of a man, attacking the deepest instincts of sexuality and reproduction. Even more striking, because Lilith was seen as an unwanted wife, ancient people even used the legal language of divorce to expel her. But most frightening of all were the accusations that she attacked children. Bowls inscribed with the name Hablas Lilith accused this being of beating, even of tearing apart and strangling innocent children. To us today, these may sound like chilling tales on the page, but to fathers and mothers thousands of years ago, Lilith was a real presence, the face of the pain they confronted every day when darkness fell. Yet Lilith is not only a figure in the ancient pages of Jewish tradition. To find her true footprints, we must travel even farther back in time, to the place where the first civilizations of humanity began to take shape. Lilitu and Lamashtu, the primal shadows that shaped Lilith. Did you know that the name Lilith actually reaches much farther back than the Jewish texts we usually discuss? It stretches backward through history, deep into the heart of ancient Mesopotamian society, 3,000 years before the alphabet of Ben Sira was ever written. The communities living between the two legendary rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, already carried an intense fear of demons, whose names and characteristics were strikingly similar. In Sumerian understanding, Lilitu represented spirits of the wind. Imagine the dry desert winds, invisible, yet carrying deadly danger through the darkness of night. That is exactly how they imagined these beings. This terrifying system was divided into three entities. Lilitu proper was the female demon. Lili was the spirit of a young virgin who died too soon, a being that hunted men out of a longing for the happiness she never fulfilled. And Lili was the male form, the one said to torment women. These beings possessed the very traits that would later directly shape Lilith, a connection to storms, wind, and barren desert lands. They were predators of the night, always targeting human beings in their most vulnerable moments, especially when they had fallen deeply asleep. They were considered a special danger to pregnant women who had just given birth and newborn children. And we have clear evidence of this. Sumerian incantation texts from the 3rd millennium before Christ mention these demons many times. Clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform still preserve exorcistic formulas and rituals meant to protect the home. That tells us that people in that era truly saw this as a real struggle for survival against invisible forces. However, there is an important comparison you need to notice. If Lilitu was the fear of poisonous winds, then Lamashtu was the embodiment of visible cruelty. Lamashtu, the daughter of the sky god. Anu was the most feared child-killing demon in Babylonian and Assyrian belief. Unlike ordinary evil spirits, Lamashtu was once an exiled goddess. She appears on amulets in a deeply disturbing form, riding a donkey through the underworld, nursing a dog and a pig at her breasts while clutching snakes in her hands. Look closely at the contrast here. While the image of an ordinary mother symbolizes life and nourishment, Lamashtu becomes the symbol of an inverted motherhood. She nourishes what is wrong and represents fertility that has been corrupted. Her main purpose was to enter homes at night, carry children out of their cradles, cause miscarriages, or dry up a mother's milk. There is a painful truth behind this legend in the ancient world. Infant mortality claimed nearly half of all children born. To face that brutal reality, ancient people fashioned bronze and clay amulets engraved with Lamashtu's own face in order to drive her away, a way of fighting poison with poison. They wrote incantations on curtains and performed childbirth rituals in the hope of protecting their little ones. When we examine the later features of Lilith, we can see the influence of Lamashtu running all the way through them, from child abduction to nighttime intrusion to associations with sickness. This was not a product of Jewish culture alone, but a dark inheritance carried over from Babylon. During the Babylonian exile, in the 6th century before Christ, Jewish scholars were immersed in Mesopotamian knowledge. They encountered these stories through their neighbors, saw the protective amulets hanging in homes, and gradually absorbed them into their own spiritual framework. The name Lilith came from Lilitu, the child-stealing traits came from Lamashtu, and the seductive element echoed Ardat Lili. Archaeological discoveries also support this transfer. Incantation bowls found throughout Mesopotamia, dating from the 3rd through the 7th centuries, mention Lilith alongside demons from both Jewish and Babylonian tradition. And this reveals an essential truth I want you to reflect on with me. Lilith was not created entirely by theologians. She was the result of a spiritual evolution unfolding across thousands of years. Her nature is the accumulation of layer upon layer of fear from different civilizations. By the time medieval texts formally shaped her story, Lilith was already carrying the weight of 3,000 years of accumulated terror, proof that the deepest fears of humanity often share the same root no matter what name we choose to call them. But this raises an important question. How did a foreign being from Mesopotamia manage to slip into the mainstream current of Jewish and Christian faith? The answer does not lie in rumor, but in a thin yet undeniable trace within the sacred text itself, a trace sealed into Scripture. In fact, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, throughout the entire vast Hebrew Bible, the name Lilith actually appears only once. It is found in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 14, in the middle of a haunting prophecy about the downfall of Edom, a landscape of destruction and desolation. When the judgment of God falls, that the land is no longer meant for human beings, but becomes a dwelling place only for strange creatures, wild beasts, mournful birds, and even the cunning wild goats. And it is there in that ruined wasteland that the name Lilith is spoken. But my friends, this is where everything becomes complicated. In most English translations you may find on the shelves of your family library, the word Lilith is often missing altogether. Instead, translators choose phrases such as night creature, screech owl, or night monster. For hundreds of years, language scholars have struggled to determine what the prophet Isaiah truly meant to point to. The Hebrew root lael does indeed mean night. So technically it could simply refer to some kind of nocturnal bird. The chilling cry of an owl among the ruins would certainly fit the atmosphere of loneliness. And yet, there is a weakness in that bird interpretation. Why would the author use such a rare and unusual term for a bird? When the Bible already had more common names for such creatures, the uniqueness of the word suggests that Isaiah may have intended to point to something beyond the natural world, a particular being. The context here is extremely important. Isaiah describes the land of Edom as being turned into an uninhabitable place. Palaces overgrown with thorns, ruins becoming dens for wild animals. And in the middle of that chaos, Lilith appears. She belongs to the wilderness, dwelling in places where human beings once lived, but where nothing remains now except dust and sand. That very connection to these forgotten spaces later became the soul of the legends told about her. Early Jewish interpreters who understood the language of their ancestors deeply did not accept the idea that she was merely a bird. The Aramaic Targum translated the term directly as a demon. The Greek Septuagint went even further by using the word Lamia, a child-devouring demon. Even Saint Jerome, when translating the Bible into Latin in the Vulgate, also chose the word Lamia, formally sealing that demonic image into the imagination of medieval Christianity. You see, this single line became Lilith's legal proof of identity. Without it, she might have remained nothing more than a fragmentary folktale with no clear beginning or end. But because of it, mystics could confidently declare, look, Scripture itself confirms her existence. From that small textual seed they cultivated an entire vast system of mythology. Some believed she remained there because the desert had been her home ever since she left Eden. She came to embody the chaos that takes over when civilization collapses. Medieval works even built on this idea to describe her with wings, claws, or the feet of a lion, hybrid forms of beast and demon that Isaiah's passage seemed almost accidentally to authorize. But in the end, we have to admit one truth: that verse remains brief and deeply ambiguous. Everything most expansive about Lilith and the demonic offspring associated with her is in reality the result of centuries of human effort to fill in the gaps Isaiah left behind. What do you think about this journey? Is Lilith a symbol of freedom purchased at the terrible price of eternal loneliness? Or is she simply the embodiment of the deepest fears human beings have ever faced when they looked into the darkness? Leave your thoughts below. I would truly love to explore these hidden corners of history together with you. And yet, Lilith's journey does not end among the ruins of Edom, or in desert tales passed from mouth to mouth. To understand why this name has endured with such force and power, we have to descend into the deepest layers of Jewish mystical thought. There, Lilith is no longer a wandering specter, but is elevated into a being with a defined rank within the structure of the universe. Lilith in the mysticism of the Zohar, from demon to queen of darkness. When we go deeper into the Zohar, the foundational text of Jewish mysticism that emerged in 13th century Spain, the image of Lilith is no longer just that of a roaming demon hunting children. Here she undergoes a startling transformation. Lilith becomes a cosmic power, a queen of darkness, ruling over a kingdom of her own. The ancient Kabbalists saw the universe as a balance of opposing extremes, light and darkness, the sacred and the profane. They believe that for every force that creates life, there is a corresponding shadow waiting to destroy it. If God and the Shekinah represent a holy union that keeps the universe in order, then darkness too would require its own powerful pair to govern chaos. That is where Lilith finds her new place beside Samael, the demonic prince, often identified with Satan. But my friends in the mystical world, Samael carries a far more complex stature. His name means venom of God, the angel of extreme severity, the ruler of the left side, the place where darkness and destruction dwell. Samael possesses terrifying power. He is the accuser, the angel of death, and the one who holds the authority to carry out the harshest judgments in the universe. So why do these two forces come together? In the stream of the Zohar, their bond is not accidental, but an inevitable attraction between shattered things cast out from holiness. When Lilith left Eden in search of freedom, she entered the wild territory of the Qliphoth, the realm of the decaying remnants of creation. There she met Samael, who also ruled a kingdom of excessive severity. In one another, they recognized a deep kinship. Both existed outside the sacred order, and both carried within themselves the desire to assert a distinct power apart from God. In the world of the Zohar, Lilith and Samael are not merely lovers. They are a dark mirror of sacred union. The Kabbalists described it this way. Without their joining, darkness would remain only scattered fragments, but together, they create an opposing kingdom with its own complete structure and hierarchy. Where the union of God and the Shekinah brings blessing and life, the demonic union of Samael and Lilith spreads corruption, becoming the source of temptation and destruction in the human world. This elevation changes the nature of Lilith completely. She is no longer a lonely creature hiding in the desert. She is a queen with a throne with armies, and with a significance that stands in dark parallel to the holiest realities. Lilith and Samael wage hidden wars to break human marriages, spread discord, and bring death. Her most precise weapon is a beauty made of illusion. She can appear as a radiant bride in order to extract the essence of man and sustain her endless demonic reproduction. And yet, this royal power begins in tragedy and in losses that could never be undone. Losses that came immediately after she left paradise. The origin of the Lilium, the vengeance of a cursed mother. After her flight from Eden and her refusal of the angel's warning, Lilith began a horrifying journey of reproduction in order to create heirs of darkness known as the Lilin. According to legend, 100 demon children are born each day, and that same day, 100 of those children must die under the curse of God. That agony turns Lilith into a machine of vengeance. Because she lost her own children, she resolves to take the children of humankind in return. The pain of a mother became a weapon, and her loss became humanity's nightmare for thousands of years. But who is the father of these countless demons? Some texts say it was Samael or Asmodeus, but there are other beliefs that are more practical and more disturbing. Lilith gathers the wasted seed of men in the night and molds demons from it. For medieval Jews, every drop of life carried the potential of a human soul. Her children, the Lilin, are not mindless monsters. They are cunning, they know language, and they are capable of bargaining. Among them, the most notable are the incubi, dark beings that press down upon women in sleep, bringing paralysis and overwhelming terror. But look more deeply into the cruelty of this. Lilith does not simply attack human beings. She attacks the very idea of motherhood. Her willingness to let 100 of her own children die each day rather than submit was, in the eyes of ancient moral thinkers, the height of cruelty. It was a rejection of the most sacred instinct of protection, turning the pain of losing children into a weapon against the world. When a mother gives up the lives of her own blood in exchange for personal freedom, she opens an abyss of emptiness, a void in which the Lilin are nourished by resentment rather than love. For fathers and mothers living in an age when medicine stood powerless before mysterious illnesses or the sudden white death of infants, Lilith became the face of pain they could not explain. Those tragedies were understood as the result of an ongoing spiritual war. And yet, even in the dense darkness of such a curse, humanity has always found a path of escape. History and faith have recorded not a few cases before which even modern medicine would have to bow in humility. There have been families who seemed utterly crushed beneath the curses of sickness or wasting away. Yet through steadfast faith in God, they found the light of healing. Remember this. In the time of Jesus, the rules of purification in ancient Jewish society were extremely strict. A woman suffering from an issue of blood was not simply considered sick, but ritually unclean in a way thought to spread defilement. Anyone who touched her or even touched the bed on which she lay was considered unclean. Just imagine it 12 years without receiving a comforting hand to hold, without sitting to eat with her family, and completely shut out from the spiritual life of the temple. She lived like a ghost among the living, stripped of dignity and stripped of the right to be loved. Scripture says that she had endured every painful treatment, yet her condition did not improve, it only grew worse. She was the very image of a family crushed beneath the curse of disease, and yet, when medicine had already bowed its head and hope had been reduced to ashes, a light appeared. She heard of Jesus not as an ordinary healer, but as the one who carried the power of God. She did not need a public ritual, nor did she dare stand openly before him because of the shame of being considered unclean. In the depths of her heart, one conviction kept sounding. If I may touch but his garment, I shall be whole. In that moment when power flowed forth according to the record of the book of Mark, something even more wonderful than physical healing took place. In the middle of the pressing crowd, Jesus stopped. He did not stop to rebuke the woman for violating the laws of ritual impurity by touching him, nor to expose her for her boldness. He stopped to honor her before everyone. With a voice full of tenderness, he acknowledged that quiet but powerful faith with words whose value still inspires to this very day. Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague. Notice the way Jesus addresses her daughter. This is the only time in the Gospels that he calls a woman by this intimate name. In that moment, she was no longer a person rejected by society, no longer the unclean woman cast aside for 12 years. He restored her personhood and brought her back as a child of light. While that poor woman had just received a miracle, another tragedy was reaching the very depths of human pain. Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, collapsed. When he received the terrible news, his only daughter, 12 years old, had breathed her last. Notice that number 12. It perfectly matches the 12 years of suffering endured by the woman with the issue of blood. It feels almost like a message that the full measure of pain had finally come to its appointed moment of release. In the midst of bitter weeping and the despair that covered the house, Jesus entered and spoke words that made every skeptic mock him. The child is not dead, but sleepeth. He walked to the bedside, took the little girl's cold hand, and spoke words filled with power. Talitha koum, which means, little girl, I say unto thee, arise. At once life returned. The child stood up and began to walk, leaving her parents in utter astonishment. That is the essential difference I want to share with you. While Lilith chose to abandon her place in pursuit of a freedom filled with resentment, this woman found true freedom through humility. She did not look into the darkness of an incurable illness, but toward the one who could restore all that had been broken. This event is the clearest living proof that when we dare to touch the sacred with pure faith, every chain of sickness and every dark curse must collapse at the foot of the cross. And when human beings place their complete trust in the Most High, they receive not only protection for the soul, but even physical wounds can be restored in wondrous ways. At that point, faith is not merely a shield against the demons of Lilith, but a renewing power proof that the light of God can always drive away the most terrifying shadows. That is why protecting the family does not simply end with outward rituals or protective charms. It rests in preserving an unshakable spiritual bond, a faith that does not break in the Most High, even when the fiercest storm arrives. And sadly, in the very life or death moment that would decide her destiny, Lilith did not choose to trust in God. She chose the self, she chose pride, and she chose freedom in the abyss rather than shelter in the light. If on that day she had chosen another path, perhaps history would not have remembered the name Lilith as a queen of terrors, and thousands of demon children would not have been born out of resentment. Lilith's choice is a chilling reminder to all of us that the line between an angel and a demon may sometimes be separated only by a single moment of faith and humility. Can you feel the tension within the figure of Lilith between a grieving mother and a bloodthirsty queen of demons? Was she the victim of a merciless destiny or the architect of collapse? Share your thoughts below. I would truly love to read your deeper reflections in the comments. But my friends, If Lilith truly was so merciless that she accepted the death of 100 of her children every single day as the price of freedom, then would she really have stood by and watched her bloodline disappear forever? A mother driven into a corner will often try to create something stronger, something more enduring, something more impossible to destroy as an act of revenge. And that brings us back to one of the most explosive questions in mystical tradition. Could it be that the pain of losing her children was what drove Lilith to unite with the fallen angels in order to give birth to giants who would challenge even heaven itself? The truth about the mother of the giants. When we open the book of Enoch, we are stepping into one of the most disputed territories in ancient Jewish tradition and extra-biblical literature. There we encounter the beings called the Watchers. In the context of Enoch, they do not appear at first as demons at all. They originally hold a noble rank, possessing knowledge, power, and belonging to the radiant order of heaven. And yet tragedy begins when they look down upon the earth, become captivated by the beauty of human women, and then make a fateful decision to cross the boundary that God had established. According to Enoch's account, around 200 Watchers under the leadership of Semyaza swore a dreadful oath together. They agreed to abandon their glorious station, descend to the earth, take human women as wives, and bring forth a hybrid generation of terrifying power, the Nephilim. Enoch speaks very clearly about this rebellion, about the forbidden knowledge they taught, and about how violence began spreading across the earth like oil across water. However, if we read carefully, Enoch never actually states that Lilith was their first woman, or that she was the mother of the Nephilim. That trail really comes from another source later in time and much more mystical in character. It is at this point that Kabbalistic tradition and later Jewish legends begin weaving themselves into the story. Just picture the dramatic logic of it if Lilith was the first woman to choose life outside the ordained order, and the Watchers were the first angels to openly break the law of heaven, then placing them together becomes an extraordinarily powerful symbolic motif. Legend says that after leaving Eden with a heart full of fury and a desperate hunger for freedom, Lilith made her way to the Red Sea, a wild place far beyond the gaze of sacred order. There among dark caves and the restless sound of waves in that land of exile, she lived as the freest and most solitary being in the world. At the same time, in the highest heavens, a group of angels, the Watchers, were also carrying within themselves a quiet rebellion. They looked down upon the earth, not with the eyes of guardianship, but with a craving for mortal experience. And then they descended. The meeting took place at the very edge of the world. Imagine that moment, Lilith, the first woman to leave paradise, standing face to face with Semyaza, and the first angels bold enough to betray God. In one another, they saw their own reflection, all of them exiles, all of them carrying a pride that refused to bow. Instead of fearing them, Lilith welcomed them. She shared with them the pain of loneliness, while the angels brought her the power and knowledge of the stars. From this deeply forbidden union, a new bloodline began to take shape in Lilith's womb. These were not ordinary children, but beings whose blood carried the dust of the earth mingled with the light of heaven. Kabbalistic tradition holds that it was in those dark caves that Lilith became the mother who nurtured the first seeds of chaos. Those children grew to giant size, bearing a strength that could shake the earth and an intelligence bold enough to challenge the angels. These were the first Nephilim beings with no place in the order of God, yet more than enough power to build a violent empire of their own. That union transformed Lilith from a wandering demon into a matriarch, the ancestral mother of a parallel history, a bloodline standing in complete opposition to the descendants of Eve. If Eve's line carried the burden of repentance, Lilith's descendants carried the DNA of pride and rebellion. This offers a profound explanation for why corruption spread so quickly. Because from the very dawn of humanity, darkness already had a mother to guide it, and rebellion already had teachers with angelic wings to shelter it. However, you need to note this carefully. This is a mystical hypothesis, built on parallels in the roles of rebels, not a fact directly confirmed in the original text. The connection between Lilith and the fallen angels can be explained through one clear and consistent thread of logic. Both represent the decision to place personal will above the common order. When Lilith chose a life outside the structure of Eden, and the Watchers chose to abandon their station in pursuit of personal desire together, they wrote a declaration of absolute freedom, a kind of freedom without responsibility, which in the end led to the collapse of an entire ancient civilization. That is why many esoteric theologians believe they fit together not only because of desire, but because they stood on the same side of the conflict between the old order and a new self-determination. At this point, I want to speak very plainly with you. When we pair Lilith with the Watchers, we move from the foundation of the original text into the realm of theological interpretation and myth. But that does not diminish the value of the story at all. On the contrary, it shows us how ancient people tried to connect scattered pieces in order to answer a massive question. What created a generation so monstrous and violent that the whole world had to be cleansed by the Great Flood? In the texts, Lilith's descendants are called the Lilim, spiritual beings associated with the night and with temptation, while Enoch describes the Nephilim as giants who ravaged the earth. But in the imagination of later generations, the line between them gradually became blurred. Both stand at the boundary between human and non-human. Both carry a force beyond control. And from there came the bold theory that Lilith may have been the first mother of a bloodline that existed even before Eve's family had time to develop. Symbolically, this is an extraordinarily powerful idea. It suggests that chaos arose almost in parallel with the very dawn of humanity. When we look closely at these striking similarities, we see that both traditions are deeply concerned with the consequences of broken boundaries. In Enoch, the broken line is between heaven and humanity. In the Lilith legends, it is the collapse of family order and the birth of rebellious power. Both are tied to dangerous knowledge, and both are used to explain the rapid corruption of the human world. Even so, if we want to make the strongest and most careful argument possible, we should call these notable parallels rather than treat them as unquestionable facts. There remains a great gap between these two streams of material in both time and context. Bringing them together is an act of creative interpretation, a human effort to search for meaning in what remains unclear. The most important point here is not whether Lilith truly gave birth to the Nephilim, but the message ancient people were trying to convey. When rebellious will joins itself to power beyond limits, the result becomes something the earth itself cannot contain. They looked at violence, war, and moral collapse, and were telling us this: behind all of those things lies a deep crisis within the very order of creation. So to understand this part of history fully, we should look at it through three distinct layers. First, what Enoch actually says about the Watchers and the Nephilim. Second, what later legend says about Lilith and the demonic bloodline. And finally, the fascinating interpretation of esoteric schools that connect those two forces together. When we separate those three layers clearly, the story of Lilith remains compelling and mysterious while still preserving fairness toward the ancient sources we have inherited. What is your perspective on this? Share your thoughts below. Astonishing power, from the exiled wife to the Queen of Darkness. To understand Lilith's place today, we must look at the chart of her power across a deeply turbulent timeline. While she was still in the Garden of Eden, Lilith's power lay only in her absolute self-possession. She carried the strength of the original, formed from sacred dust, equal with Adam. At that time, that power was simply resistance, the will of freedom bold enough to say no to patriarchal order. But my friends, it was only after she stepped beyond the boundary of paradise that Lilith's power truly began to bloom. in a terrifying way. From a lonely woman cast into exile, she transformed herself into a being of cosmic scale. If once she possessed only her own voice, now, according to Kabbalistic teaching, Lilith possesses the power to manipulate human potential. Whenever a man lets down his guard and allows his vital essence to be wasted through dreams or passing desire, Lilith appears. She does not merely pick up what has been abandoned. She is harvesting raw material to multiply her own power. She uses the stolen potential of humanity itself to forge an army of demons for her own kingdom. Beauty at that point is no longer a gift of creation, but has become a deadly weapon. The Zohar describes her form as endlessly shifting at one moment, a radiant bride luring men into a trap, at another a bent old woman carrying disease, and then again, bearing the owl wings of death. What makes her so terrifying is this: anyone who beholds Lilith's true form dies instantly. That is why she always hides herself within perfect illusions, the woman at the window or the lover in a dream, in order to take what she needs for her endless labor of reproduction. And yet Lilith could never have built such a mighty empire of darkness if she had acted alone. To turn scattered fears into a real kingdom, she needed a union of theological magnitude, a consort with equal power, one who could stand beside her and challenge heaven itself. The demonic marriage, the resonance of power with Samael. Lilith's power reaches its true peak only when she meets and unites with Samael, the demonic prince, the venom of God. This was not merely a marriage, but the establishment of an order in complete opposition to heaven. If Adam had been the husband from whom she fled because of his domination, then Samael became the missing piece through which she attained queenship. Samael represents extreme judgment and destructive force, while Lilith brings seduction and the power to multiply darkness. Their union created an organized ecosystem of evil. Their court within the realm of Qliphoth, the refuse of creation, became a perfect inverted reflection of the court of God. Notice the contrast. Wherever the sacred creates life, the union of Samael and Lilith creates destruction. But they do not do so chaotically. By standing beside Samael, Lilith is no longer a random monster. She becomes a queen. She has structure, rank, and clear purpose. She no longer hunts children merely out of personal revenge, but together with Samael wages a cosmic war to replace the lineage of light with the lineage of darkness. And to sustain that long war, Lilith turned the most sacred calling of womanhood itself into a terrifying weapon. Endless childbirth joined to endless curses. Lilith's reproduction is the most painful proof of both her power and her hatred. After refusing the angel's ultimatum, she began an unimaginable cycle of reproduction, 100 children each day. But with that power came a brutal curse: for every 100 she bore 100 demon children. The Lilith also had to die each day. This is an infinite cycle of birth and destruction. It explains why demons seem limitless. Lilith's womb itself became an unceasing machine of regeneration. The pain of losing children every day turned her into a maddened avenger. She took the children of humankind to make up for the demon children she had lost. Her loss became an inherited terror for humanity. Her children, the Lilith, inherit everything most cunning from their mother. They understand human beings well because they carry within themselves a portion of stolen potential from humanity. They are not merely dark shadows causing nightmares, but beings capable of planning, deceiving, and draining the life of their victims with great subtlety. For parents in the Middle Ages, Lilith and her brood were the only explanation for mysterious tragedies. But if we pull back the veil of myth, you can see that this is really the story of two family models standing in brutal opposition to one another. While our human family is built on the foundation of hope, where each generation continues, strengthens, and longs for its children to surpass their parents, the family of Lilith and Samael is a cycle of eternal damage. If the human family is a symbol of building, then Lilith's family is a symbol of dissolution. The most realistic difference is this: human parents work, save, and sacrifice in order to leave a legacy of peace for their children, Lilith and Samael, by contrast, leave no legacy. They leave after effects. They do not nurture, they only reproduce pain. The Lilith are not born from love, but forged out of resentment and the need to take revenge on the world. They have no future of their own. They are only instruments extending their mother's personal war from one millennium to the next. So this is no longer a distant legend, but an intensely practical spiritual battle taking place inside every home. It is the unending effort of parents to protect their children from the ghosts of the past, from destructive habits, and even from the invisible dangers their own ancestors once had to confront. This battle reminds us that protecting a child is not merely a matter of feeding and clothing them, but of guarding their soul from being pulled into the vortex of hatred and the cycles of collapse that have existed since the dawn of humanity. And yet Lilith's dark legacy does not end with vengeance aimed at fragile young souls. When those seeds of resentment mature and take on new forms, they create a more complex network of evil spirits, attacking human steadfastness and vitality directly under powerful masculine forms. That is when we must face the other faces within her kingdom of darkness. The sons of Lilith incubi plague demons and evil spirits. Lilith's male descendants occupy a distinct place in demonology, while her female descendants are given individual names and personalities. Her sons usually appear more as a collective force. They are incubi, bringers of pestilence and spirits of nocturnal assault. In medieval understanding, an incubus was a demon that pressed down upon sleeping women. The weight on the chest during sleep paralysis, the sensation of being pinned down, the terror of being unable to move or cry out. All of these experiences were attributed to incubi. The very name comes from Latin and means to lie upon. Jewish writings describe these male demons as seeking out human women for the same reason Lilith sought out human men to produce more demons. When an incubus came to a woman, it might appear in a dream as her husband or as a stranger. The encounter could feel very real, very vivid, sometimes even pleasant, though at other times terrifying. Morning brought confusion and shame. Women who had such dreams often remained silent, afraid of being accused of adultery or madness. Yet, according to tradition, these were not illusions. They were real intrusions by demons, violations carried out by spirits, able to pass through the boundary between sleep and waking. Children conceived from such unions created theological problems. Were they fully human or partly demonic? Some writings suggest that children conceived through an incubus visitation carried subtle signs. They might be unusually intelligent or unusually beautiful, or they might bring misfortune upon their families. Medieval people sometimes blamed strange traits or troubling behavior on demonic ancestry. Beyond sexual assault, Lilith's sons were also known as carriers of disease. Plague demons were understood as real beings that caused sickness through their very presence. Fever was not merely a symptom. It was a demon that had entered and had to be expelled. Different sons carried different illnesses. Some brought plague. Some brought wasting disease. Some specialized in fevers that rose at night and eased by morning. Others caused the coughing fits that carried children away young. Every sickness had its demon, and many of those demons were counted among Lilith's male descendants. The Mesopotamian roots are especially visible in this part of the tradition. The ancient world understood disease as demonic in origin. Medicine and exorcism went hand in hand. Healing required both physical remedies and spiritual defense. Jewish demonological tradition inherited that framework and then adapted it. Lilith's sons also appear in texts dealing with possession. While Lilith herself might trouble from the outside, invading homes and children's cradles, her sons could enter the human body itself. They spoke through the victim's mouth using that person's own voice. Specific exorcism rites were developed to drive out these possessing spirits. Compared with the daughters who were given names, these sons remained largely anonymous. We do not have vast mythologies about each individual male demon the way we do with Agrat bat Mahlat or Naamah. The sons function more as a category, a type of collective threat. They are many, and for the most part, interchangeable. That difference may reflect cultural attitudes toward gender and danger. Female demons threaten through seduction and child abduction, fears closely tied to women's social roles. Male demons threaten through force and disease, a more generalized kind of violence. Female demons were individualized because the fears they embodied were more complex. Male demons may have remained unnamed because the brute harm they caused seemed to require less explanation. Even so, some male demons in the broader tradition were at times identified as sons of Lilith. Asmodeus, the demon of wrath and lust, in the Book of Tobit, appears in some writings as either her lover or her son. The sources are not consistent. He sows discord and marriage prevents weddings from being fulfilled, or causes conflict between husband and wife. Other named male demons include those responsible for specific illnesses. The demon of the every other day fever striking on every fourth day. The demon of wasting disease causing the body to wither slowly. The demon of madness stealing away reason. Jewish magical writings named and bound each such spirit, attempting to protect people from the particular harms they caused. Incubi were especially associated with monasteries and unmarried women. Christian demonology emphasized this danger heavily. Nuns and virginal women were seen as primary targets, perhaps because their celibacy was viewed as unnatural by demonic standards. A violation of order that demons sought to correct through violation. Jewish tradition, by contrast, was more concerned about wives being visited by demons while their husbands were away. Long periods of separation were thought to leave women vulnerable. Men were warned to return home quickly, lest demons take advantage of their wives' loneliness. The intimacy demons offered was only a cruel imitation of true marriage, exploiting the human need for comfort and touch. Protection against incubi and plague demons required constant vigilance. Prayer before sleep. The recitation of certain psalms and the wearing of amulets on an ongoing basis, not only during pregnancy and infancy. The home itself had to be maintained in a state of continual spiritual defense, mezuzot on the doors, blessings spoken at the threshold, and certain herbs hung in the windows. These male demons also served as the infantry in the cosmic war between holiness and corruption. If Lilith and her female descendants were often portrayed as queens and princesses of the demonic realm, then her sons were the army. They carried out most of the labor of evil, the daily hard work of tormenting humankind. The first daughters, Agrat bat Mahlat and Naamah. In our journey to trace the origins of darkness, we find that Lilith's rebellion did not end with her. It was passed down and magnified through her most powerful descendants. Among Lilith's countless female offspring, two names stand out in Jewish mysticism as beings with distinct realms and unmistakable identity: Agrat bat Mahlat and Naamah. They appear again and again in Kabbalistic writings as true demon queens inheriting power from their mother in order to extend the reach of darkness into the human world. The name Agrat bat Mahlat appears in Talmudic sources from the early centuries after Christ. Her title carries the sense of sickness or dissolution, marking her as a being born out of corruption itself. The Talmud describes her with tremendous authority, commanding 180,000 angels of destruction moving through the night sky in a great chariot. Wednesday night and Saturday night are described as the times of her greatest activity, when her demonic procession sweeps through crossroads, places where people believed encountering her meant certain death. However, notice this detail. A rabbi who lived in the 4th century was said to have negotiated with Agrat in order to limit her movements. That tells us she possessed intelligence, pride, and the capacity to keep an agreement. Later, the Zohar places her as the queen who rules the West, commanding violent demons that bring sudden death. She also comes to embody the wild dance, a symbol of the danger that arises when human beings surrender the control of the mind and allow the body to be swept away in frenzy. But if Agrat is the storm outside, then her sister Naamah is the abyss within. Her name appears in Genesis chapter 4, verse 22. As the sister of Tubal-Cain, yet post-biblical tradition transformed that brief mention into a terrifying figure, a demoness so seductive that even angels could be ensnared by her. Here we must look directly at a harsh reality: corruption through desire. Naamah is not driven by vengeance, the way Lilith is, but is focused purely on seduction. She appears in the dreams of men in the form of a succubus, a being able to read the heart and take on exactly the appearance each person desires most. She does not seduce through beauty in some general sense, but through temptation custom-tailored to the weakness of each individual. In the modern world, we might call that adultery of the mind. But according to the Zohar, it is the work of Naamah. She causes men to betray their wives in thought before they ever do so in action. Jesus himself gave a severe warning about this in Matthew chapter 5, verse 28. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Naamah's harm is more subtle and in many ways more condemnable than Agrat's violence. She does not destroy the body at once, but slowly drains vitality through her nighttime visitations. Men who fall into this snare become pale, weak, and exhausted because the sacred life force that should have been reserved for family and for life itself is wasted upon demonic illusions. Both of these daughters inherit immortality and power from their mother. They have continued their work for thousands of years, forcing every generation of mankind to confront the very demons their ancestors once feared. At times, their relationship with Lilith is cooperative, at times competitive. Yet together they have come to cover the whole terrifying world of darkness, naming Agrat as the source of sudden calamity or violence, and Naamah as the source of lustful dreams and the draining of life force. Was the way ancient people tried to identify the enemy in order to protect the household. General protection against demons was not enough. When facing queens with distinct realms like these, human beings needed a specific faith and an iron spiritual discipline. Remember, this faithfulness in marriage is not merely a social commitment, but a spiritual shield. When we preserve the sacredness of marital devotion, we are directly restraining the seductive power of Naamah and keeping the flame of life within the family from being stolen by darkness. You see, these stories are not merely ancient myths. They are mirrors reflecting the darkest corners of the human soul. Between violence and desire, between surrendering self-control and betraying in secret, we always need vigilance in order to protect ourselves and the ones we love. What do you think about the power of this kind of custom-tailored temptation in life today? Could it be that Naamah is still working quietly behind digital screens and nameless cravings? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In that darkness, Naamah is far from alone. She stands at the head of a professionalized army of evil spirits, devoted to stealing life force beings that slip into every breath of the night in order to turn the most secret human longing into a weapon of self-destruction. The history of mysticism gives them a chilling name: succubi, the succubi daughters of seduction and theft. The succubus is perhaps the most persistent and widespread aspect of Lilith's legacy. These female demons who come to men in the darkness appear in many traditions, from medieval Europe to ancient Persia, from Jewish mysticism to Catholic demonology. They share a common purpose: to take male seed in order to create more demons. The word succubus comes from Latin and means to lie beneath. This distinguishes them from incubi, who lie upon their victims. Yet that term conceals the true belief behind them. Succubi were understood to be active aggressors, not passive partners. They initiate the encounter, shape the dream, and then take what they need. In Jewish tradition, these female demons are clearly understood as daughters of Lilith, inheriting both the methods and the motives of their mother. Just as Lilith comes to men to gather spilled seed, so do her daughters. They appear as beautiful women in dreams, as fleeting figures in dark corners, as sudden and intense desires that fall upon a man in the night. This mechanism was understood in a very literal sense. When a man experienced arousal in his sleep, it was believed that demons were truly present, manipulating both his dreams and his body. The pleasure he felt was not considered natural, but the result of demonic influence. The emission that followed became raw material for the creation of more demons. This belief turned ordinary bodily functions into a spiritual battlefield. Nocturnal emission, which today we understand as a natural physiological response, was then interpreted as a demonic attack that had to be resisted. Boys entering puberty were understood to be stepping onto a battlefield. Every night carried the possibility of assault. Every morning could mean that they had unwittingly fathered demons. The children born from such unions created serious theological difficulties. Were they real beings or not? Some texts say that succubi do not become pregnant themselves, but instead use the seed they have stolen to impregnate mortal women, creating the illusion that the woman's husband is the father of the child. Other texts claim that demonic offspring exist only in the spiritual realm and never take on material form. Medieval Christian demonologists developed long arguments about succubi. They debated whether demons could actually experience pleasure or only imitate it. They also discussed whether the body temperature of a demon was different from that of a human being. Most agreed that demons carried an unnatural coldness. They also examined whether demonic encounters could lead to conception. Some teachings held that demons could not create life because life requires a soul and only God can give a soul. So a demon would come to a man as a succubus, take his seed, then come to a woman as an incubus and implant that same seed. The child born would technically still be human with two human parents. But the conception would have taken place through demonic intervention. This explanation was convenient because it accounted for suspicious pregnancies. It also explained children born with unusual temperaments or strange traits. If a child seemed not right in some way, demonic involvement at the time of conception became the answer without forcing an accusation of adultery upon the mother. Succubi are masters of imitation. They can take the form of a man's own wife so that he does not realize the one lying beside him is not truly his wife at all. They can take the form of someone he has once seen and secretly desired. They can even read his mind and become the exact image of his most perfect imagined longing. This ability to change shape makes them almost impossible to identify during the encounter itself. Recognition comes only afterward. Men visited by them were believed to show certain signs: extreme exhaustion, weakness, pallor, sluggishness, wasting, and a loss of interest in their real wives. Some men became obsessed, longing for the demon to return. Part of the succubus's power lay in the addictive quality of such encounters. Defense required both physical and spiritual measures. Men were taught to sleep with a light still burning, to recite protective prayers before sleep, to wear certain amulets, and to make sure their beds had been blessed. Married men were advised to remain close to their wives because a rightly sanctified marriage was believed to provide strong protection. The fear of succubi also reinforced celibacy and sexual restraint. Men were warned that any pleasure outside marriage ordered toward procreation opened a door to demons. Masturbation was not merely a sin. It was understood as a direct act of feeding the enemy. This teaching gave sexual boundaries an enormous spiritual weight. Women, too, could be suspected of being succubi in human form. According to some teachings, beautiful women who stirred desire were sometimes suspected of being demons, or at least under demonic influence. This suspicion fell especially upon women living outside male oversight widows, prostitutes, and independent women. Their sexuality, because it was not under the control of a husband, gradually became associated with evil. The succubus myth also provided a language for explaining sleep paralysis and related phenomena, the feeling that someone is present in the room. The inability to move, the sensation of pressure on the chest, the awareness of a figure approaching the bed. All of these could be understood as a demonic visitation. Night terrors, sleep disturbances, and vivid hallucinations along the border between waking and sleep all found their explanation in the image of the succubus. The experiences themselves were certainly real. It was only the interpretation of that age that attributed them to the daughters of Lilith rather than to the nervous system. Modern psychology sees the succubus phenomenon as a cultural interpretation of natural human experiences. But for medieval people, this was not a metaphor or a later added explanation. They believed these were real beings causing real harm. Rabbis performed exorcisms for men who were visited too often. Priests assigned acts of penance. Healers gave them protective amulets. The succubus embodies the dark side of desire itself. She personifies the fear that sexuality can slip out of human control, that even in sleep, when all defenses are lowered, forbidden impulses can rise to the surface. She is the return of what has been repressed, desires pushed down in waking life, but taking shape in dreams. By pushing those desires outward, by assigning them to attacking demons, the myth gave people a way to acknowledge powerful impulses without having to take direct responsibility for them. Entities that reclaim life force, the dark underside of motherhood. Of all the roles assigned to Lilith and her daughters, no aspect spread deeper terror through the ancient world than their reputation as beings who seize the souls of children. This part of the myth did not arise by accident. It emerged directly from the painful reality of infant mortality in the pre-modern world, a world in which death always seemed to linger beside the cradle. In ancient Mesopotamia, perhaps 40% to 50% of children did not survive their first year of life. The sudden mysterious deaths that modern medicine now identifies as sudden infant death syndrome, or SIDS, were at that time an abyss without explanation. Parents would go to sleep beside a healthy, rosy child only to wake and find that child cold and motionless. No explanation, no warning signs, only an incomprehensible loss and overwhelming confusion. The human mind has always needed some point of reference by which to name its pain. When a newborn stopped breathing in the night, when a pregnancy ended for no apparent reason, or when a healthy child suddenly began to fade, within only a few days, people needed some way to understand why. And Lilith became the face of that merciless fate. The legend says that Lilith especially targeted souls that had not yet received a complete identity. The first 8 days of a baby boy's life, or the first 20 days of a baby girl's life. When the child had not yet been named and had not yet fully entered the community, were considered the most vulnerable period to the forces of darkness. People believed that evil spirits would slip into the house at night, come to the cradle, and reclaim the child's breath, or replace a healthy infant with a withered one. Even pregnant women had to face this threatening presence. Lilith was believed to be able to disturb the child in the womb, dry up a mother's milk after birth, or bring violent fevers into the birthing room. The image of a strangling entity was really the ancient way of personifying helplessness before infant suffocation. The bluish symptoms that modern medicine explains physiologically were at that time understood as the mark of a visitation from the underworld. More tragically still, some texts even describe the sound of children crying faintly in the night in Naamah. In houses where a recent death had occurred, people believed this was proof that those little souls were being held in the hands of demons, playing in some distant realm of spirits. Lilith's motive is deeply personal and bitterly vengeful. She lost her own children because she refused to submit, and now every human life she takes seems to restore that balance just a little. Her daughters inherit that mission. They do not attack at random, but continue their mother's eternal revenge against the descendants of Adam and Eve. In particular, Lilith was often believed to target the children of women who showed pride or neglected spiritual protections. Because of this fear, protective customs became extremely elaborate. The red thread tied around the wrist, protective amulets placed around the birthing room, or the practice of keeping someone awake beside the cradle for weeks at a time. All of these became the price of survival. Naming ceremonies were performed as early as possible in order to seal the child's identity under divine protection and lessen the hunger of demons. This myth also offered an explanation for the pain of childless couples. Infertility was not merely a biological risk, but a spiritual battle in which the womb had been locked shut by invisible forces. Yet beyond explanation, this myth served an important psychological function. It gave parents something they could do. Instead of standing helplessly by while their child faded before fate, protective rituals gave them the right to fight. Lighting a candle, wearing an amulet, or speaking a prayer. These were ways for human beings to reclaim some measure of control over what could not truly be controlled. The collective nature of this threat also created communal solidarity. Mothers shared protective knowledge, kept vigil together, and comforted one another through loss. They affirmed that tragedy did not happen because the mother had failed, but because darkness itself was cruel. Even in the modern age, though, we have replaced the language of demonology with medical terminology. The pain of losing a child in sleep has not lessened. Lilith and her daughters embody humanity's deepest fear, that love alone is sometimes still not enough to guarantee absolute safety. By giving that terror a name and a face, this myth offered humanity a small sense of psychological control, turning a blind fate into an enemy against which we could at least keep watch. And once the enemy had been revealed, humanity never simply stood by with folded arms. Rather than surrendering to fear, our ancestors raised an invisible yet powerful line of defense at the very points of greatest vulnerability beside the cradle and the bed. That was the moment when prayers became weapons and ordinary objects became sacred shields in a long and difficult battle of spiritual warfare. Amulets and incantations, the magical warfare at the bedside. If demons constantly threatened homes, children, and sleepers, then protection required constant vigilance and powerful magic. Jewish communities developed an extensive arsenal of defensive measures against Lilith and her offspring. These were not viewed as mere superstitions, but as serious magical technologies carefully crafted and ritually charged. Amulets were the most visible and widespread form of protection. These were small objects inscribed with names, symbols, and incantations worn on the body or hung in specific places. They ranged from simple to elaborate, inexpensive, to costly, generic, to custom-made. The most common form listed the names of three angels, Senoi, Sansenoi, and Semangelof. These were the three angels God sent to retrieve Lilith from the Red Sea. Although they failed to bring her back, they extracted a promise from her. She swore that whenever she saw their names, she would have no power to harm. So displaying their names functioned like a binding contract, forcing Lilith to keep her word. Other amulets used divine names and biblical verses. Psalm 91, which speaks of protection from terrors of the night, appeared often. The Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith, served as a powerful defense. Divine names written in specific patterns created protective barriers. Crimson threads offered inexpensive and accessible protection. A crimson thread tied around a newborn's wrist or worn by a pregnant woman carried protective power. The color crimson itself was considered apotropaic, capable of warding off evil. Some traditions connected this to the color of blood, symbolizing a life force that demons could not easily overcome. Bowls inscribed with incantations formed another major category of protection. These incantation bowls, discovered across Mesopotamia and the Levant, date from the 3rd to 7th centuries of the Common Era. Archaeologists have recovered thousands of them, giving physical evidence of how widespread these beliefs were. The bowls were inscribed on the inside with spiraling text, often in Aramaic or Hebrew, and sometimes in multiple languages. The text named the person or family receiving protection, listed the demons being driven away, invoked angels and divine names, and commanded the demons to depart. Once inscribed, the bowl was placed upside down beneath thresholds in room corners or buried at the boundaries of a property. Some incantation bowls named Lilith, directly commanding her to leave and never return. Others listed her daughters beside her. The formulas often included threats. If the demon refused to leave, greater powers would be summoned to bind or destroy her. The texts created a hierarchy of spiritual authority, with the demon at the very bottom. One common formula declared, "You are bound by the angels of the Lord, sealed by the seal of Solomon, forbidden entry by the names written here." This invoked multiple sources of authority, angelic power, the legendary magic of King Solomon, and the force of the inscribed divine names themselves. Homes required regular spiritual maintenance. When moving into a house, people placed protective inscriptions on door frames. Mezuzot, small cases containing parchment inscribed with biblical verses, were fixed to doorposts. Windows might carry carved protective symbols in their frames. The home became a fortress, every point of entry warded. Birthing chambers received special preparation. Before labor began, the room would be set with amulets hung on all 4 walls, protective verses written on paper, and placed under the mattress, and specific herbs scattered across the floor. Some customs involved drawing a circle around the bed with chalk or salt, creating a bounded space demons could not cross. After birth, the mother and child remained inside this protected space during the dangerous first weeks. Visitors were limited and screened. Those who entered had to perform ritual washing and speak protective words. The goal was to reduce every possible opening through which demons might break in. Men worried about nocturnal emissions and succubus attacks used different protections. They wore amulets while sleeping, recited prayers before bed, and avoided sleeping in rooms with mirrors, since demons were thought to travel through reflective surfaces. Some especially anxious men stayed awake through the night, studying holy texts, using constant engagement with sacred words as an act of defense. Protective formulas often included conditional warnings. If you approach this house, if you enter this room, if you touch this child, then punishment will follow. This created a deterrent effect, warning demons that crossing the boundary would bring consequences. Some amulets were proactive rather than defensive. Instead of merely driving Lilith away, they commanded her to perform protective duties. Certain texts attempted to bind her power and turn it toward guarding children rather than harming them. This inversion of her nature was considered especially powerful magic because it turned her own force against demonic threats from elsewhere. The effectiveness of these protections was reinforced constantly through selective memory. When a child wearing an amulet survived, the amulet had worked. When a child without an amulet died, the lack of protection was blamed. When a child wearing an amulet still died, the explanation pointed to an improper ritual, a corrupted amulet, or an unusually strong demonic assault that demanded even stronger countermeasures. This created a self-sustaining system. Tragedy reinforced belief in demons. Belief in demons required protections. Protections sometimes coincided with survival. Survival then proved that both the demons and the protections were real. The cycle continued across generations. The archaeological record confirms how seriously these beliefs were taken. Thousands upon thousands of amulets and bowls survive. Wealthy families commissioned elaborate silver amulets. Poor families used paper inscribed with the same formulas. Everyone, regardless of status, took part in the magical warfare against Lilith and her offspring. Modern eyes may see these as quaint folk customs, but they represented real terror and real hope. Parents burying incantation bowls under their homes believed they were taking concrete action to protect their children. Women wearing amulets through pregnancy believed they were fighting for their baby's life. Magic was as real as medicine and often more accessible and affordable. The woman in red Lilith in the world of Christian demonology. My dear friends, when we look at the history of the early church, we can see that the church fathers faced a fascinating dilemma. They could not completely deny the ancient Jewish texts that spoke of Lilith, yet this being does not appear directly by that name in the New Testament. So rather than eliminating that figure altogether, they chose a different path. Their solution was absorption and transformation. Lilith did not disappear. She simply hid herself beneath new names and new symbols, especially the image of the woman in red. From that point on, Lilith's journey no longer belonged only to Jewish legend, but began to enter the theological imagination of Christianity in a new form, more subtle, yet also more frightening. The clearest and only direct anchor for Lilith in the Old Testament lies in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 14. In the context of the prophecy concerning the destruction of Edom, the text says, "The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The night creature Lilith also shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest." In the King James Version and other older translations, the word Lilith is often replaced with screech owl or night monster. But for scholars, this is the very moment in which Lilith becomes biblicized. She is no longer a woman, but becomes a wild being dwelling among ruins, waiting for the collapse of the kingdoms of men. What matters here is that from that rare point of appearance, Lilith is already associated with devastation, with places that once held life, but now remain only in silence and unease. That connection opened the way for later interpretations, as theologians began to ask whether this being was truly confined only to a desolate land, or whether she continued to appear in other forms throughout the history of human salvation. From that question, medieval theologians turned back to an even more foundational scene, the story of the fall in Genesis. They asked a difficult question. Why was the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 able to speak and understand the psychology of women so deeply? Their argument was that the serpent was not merely an animal, but was possessed by the spirit of the wife who had been cast out. This line of reasoning did not arise by accident. It reflects the effort of people in that era to connect scattered pieces into a more continuous story about the origin of rebellion. That is why in Renaissance art, most famously in Michelangelo's painting in the Sistine Chapel, the serpent coiled around the tree of knowledge bears the face and breasts of a woman. That is precisely the presence of Lilith, the one who had already been driven out of paradise, now returning to lure Eve into the same path of rebellion that she herself had taken. The logic here is very clear. Only one who had already tasted freedom outside all restraint could teach Eve how to reject the order of God. In this way, Lilith is no longer merely a faint shadow in the wilderness. She begins to be seen as an active force, one who returns from the past to continue shaping the future of humanity. And as that image continued to develop in Christian thought, it did not stop in the Garden of Eden. At this point, we enter the most debated and also the most compelling part of all the connection between Lilith and the woman in the book of Revelation. This is the most striking and detailed part of Lilith's return under the form of the woman in red. In Revelation chapter 17, St. John described a haunting vision of a woman. "And I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication." Revelation 17, 3-4. Christian demonologists saw in this a perfect correspondence with Lilith. Scarlet is the color of lust, violence, and defiance. If Lilith is the mother of demons, then the woman in Revelation is called the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, Revelation 17:5. What makes this association so powerful is that the figure is no longer attached to one single individual, but is elevated into the symbol of a force with both historical and spiritual magnitude. The appearance of this woman at the end of history becomes the symbol of the rise of absolute rebellious femininity. She submits to no one, she rules over kingdoms, and she is drunken with the blood of the saints. For the medieval church, Lilith was no longer simply an individual from the past, but had become a supernatural force that would return to carry out the final war against heavenly order. In other words, from a rare name in Isaiah through a hidden symbol in Genesis, Lilith was now elevated into a complete model of rebellion, standing in direct opposition to redemption. That is why, to help readers and listeners understand Lilith's place in the Christian symbolic system, theologians often placed her within a very clear structure of contrast. To strengthen the logic for an American audience, please look at this triangular structure. First, we have Eve, the woman who fell yet still longed for redemption. She is the embodiment of human weakness before a temptation. But after her sin, Eve carried sorrow and remorse throughout the rest of her journey upon the earth. She represents the most deeply human part of us, those who go astray, yet still ache as they look toward heaven for a chance to return. And yet, if Eve was the one who unintentionally opened the door to death, then that order required another hand to close it again. That is where we see the appearance of the Virgin Mary, the woman of absolute obedience. Mary is not merely a woman. She is regarded as the new Eve. If Eve said no to the command of God in order to follow her own will, then Mary said yes in complete humility. Behold the handmaid of the Lord. Be it unto me according to thy word. Luke chapter 1 verse 38. Mary brought forth the Savior in order to repair the deep-rooted consequences of the error Eve had left behind for the human race. But between Eve's remorse and Mary's obedience, there still remains a dark void, a completely different extreme that accepts no reconciliation at all. Standing in total opposition to both of them is Lilith, the woman in red, the woman who rejects all redemption. If Mary is the summit of obedience, and Eve is the fall marked by regret, then Lilith represents radical selfhood, a pride that will not bend. She has no need of heaven and no need of forgiveness. Lilith chooses to stand outside every plan of redemption established by the Creator in order to become queen of herself in darkness. She is the symbol of eternal rebellion, a reminder that evil does not always come from weakness, but sometimes from excessive self-exaltation. When we look at these three figures together, we see that this is not merely a doctrinal comparison, but the way medieval Christianity reordered the entire story of womanhood within the history of salvation. While Mary accepts the words of the angel, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord. Be it unto me according to thy word," Lilith says, "Instead, I will not submit." That very contrast intensified Marian devotion during the Middle Ages, presenting the Virgin Mary as a shield protecting humanity from the temptation of the woman in red lurking outside. Here Mary is not only the model of obedience, but the direct answer to the threat that Lilith represents. If Eve stands for the fall, yet still retains hope of return, then Lilith stands for the refusal to return at all costs. This structure makes the role of each figure very clear and creates a continuous theological logic from the beginning all the way to the end of history. So when we bring all of these layers of meaning together, we begin to see something deeply worth reflecting on. Do you notice how the Bible never directly names Lilith and yet still describes the woman in red in Revelation? Is that not a profoundly intentional move? It shows us that evil does not always need a fixed name. It only needs a nature, pride, and desire. That nature is the thread that runs through every age, from the wasteland of Edom to the first garden and onward into the final visions of the end of days. The presence of the woman in red in history is a reminder that the battle between faithfulness and rebellion has never ended. It is fought in every decision, in every desire, even in our lives today. The Kingdom of Zamarad, the geography of a demonic empire. My friends, if Lilith represents a rebellious self within the human mind, ancient myth does not stop there. From a very early time, people did not fear darkness only as an abstract idea. They wanted to know where that darkness was, where it came from, why it seemed to draw closer at certain times, and why certain lands, certain hours of the night, and certain thresholds made people more uneasy than usual. That is why mystical traditions gradually constructed a kind of geography of evil, where darkness did not dwell only in the soul, but also had its own strongholds, borders, pathways, and territories upon this very earth. In the earliest layer of tradition, Lilith is associated with desolate places, lands left abandoned after judgment, especially the ruined landscape of Edom in Isaiah, where wild beasts, night demons, and creatures living outside human order gather together. This matters greatly because, from her rare appearance in the Hebrew Bible onward, Lilith is not linked to warm homes or ordered communities, but to ruins, decay, and the empty spaces human beings have left behind. From there, the desert became an almost natural choice for the religious imagination. The desert has no clear borders, no walls, no protection of community, and in the ancient mind, it is the place where the ordinary laws of human life begin to weaken. The wind in the desert is not merely wind. It can be a call, a sign, a presence of what cannot be seen. So when legend says that Lilith left Eden and went toward the Red Sea, that does not carry only a geographical meaning, but a very powerful symbolic one as well. She leaves ordered space and enters the frontier of chaos, where family order no longer exists, where the sheltering presence of paradise is gone, and where she herself becomes another kind of power, a power that does not submit. In the tradition recorded by the Encyclopedia Judaica, it was there at the Red Sea that the three angels found her and gave her an ultimatum to return to Adam. But she refused, and from that point the legend of the being who harms infants, threatens women in childbirth, and gives birth to countless demons became firmly established. However, once we enter the world of Kabbalah, that map becomes far deeper. Here, Lilith's dwelling is no longer merely a desert or a body of water. The central concept now is Sitra Achra, meaning the other side, or as many scholars understand it, the side set in opposition to the holy world, a dark reflection of divine order. In mystical tradition, this is not a nation in the ordinary sense, but a parallel system of existence, a realm of reality in which everything belonging to impurity, temptation, death, and rebellion is organized into its own separate order. It is here that Lilith is no longer simply a wandering she-demon. She becomes the queen of the impure forces, standing beside Samael like a dark counter-image of the Shekinah in the holy world. In other words, if the sacred world has structure, hierarchy, center, and boundary, then Lilith's world in Kabbalah does as well. Except that it is built out of inversion, corruption, and resistance. So when certain later traditions mention Zamarad, or more precisely in some reference works, Zemergad or Smargad, we should understand this very carefully. This is indeed a name that appears in post-canonical traditions related to Lilith. The Jewish encyclopedia even records the title Queen of Zemargad, but the core sources do not describe it clearly as a fully developed kingdom with borders, history, and independent structure like a political map. What is more certain is that the name reflects a later effort to locate Lilith, to give her a throne, a territory, and a court, so that fear would no longer remain vague. In other words, Zamarad is useful as a literary and mystical symbol, But if we are being strict at the textual level, Sitra Achra remains the strongest foundation for speaking of an empire of darkness in Kabbalah. From this point, the picture becomes clearer. Lilith's kingdom does not lie in only one place. It is the sum of all those spaces where ordinary human order has weakened. It is the desert where no one keeps watch. It is the ruins of judged cities where people once lived, but where now only the wind remains. It is the deep waters, uneasy shorelines, and places that carry the memory of destruction, such as the Red Sea, the Dead Sea, and in the popular imagination, even the remembered landscape of Sodom and Gomorrah. On another level of meaning, these are also liminal spaces, transitional places such as doorways, crossroads, the stroke of midnight, the moment between day and night, and the border between waking and dreaming. It was precisely in such places that ancient people believed the veil between the visible world and the invisible one grew thinnest, and that is why demons could slip into human life more easily there. That is also why the other queens of the demonic realm do not operate in random, disorganized chaos. They have their own territories and their own rhythms of activity. Agrat bat Mahlat in rabbinic and later tradition is a very clear example of this. She is not merely a vague ghost, but a force that moves on specific nights, accompanied by a large procession of destruction. And the rabbinic texts themselves associate her with dangerous times, when people were warned not to go out alone. This shows that in the religious imagination, darkness does not merely have shape, but also schedule route and rules of appearance. That makes fear far more concrete. Not demons are somewhere, but demons pass through here at this hour. Naamah is different. If Agrat resembles a host moving across the night sky, Naamah in Kabbalistic tradition and folk literature is more often associated with the deep, with quiet seduction, with dreams, with still water, and with the great sea. The National Library of Israel, in summarizing traditions about Naamah, also notes that in some texts, her dwelling is placed in the depths of the great sea, from which she comes forth to seduce human beings in the night, and to involve herself in sickness, dreams, and temptations that are difficult to name. This helps us see a fascinating layering within the geography of demons. Some move in the air, some dwell in the abyss below. Some reside in the desert, some linger among ruins, and together they form a counterworld set against the ordinary living space of humankind. If we look at this entire picture all at once, we will see that what ancient people were really doing was not simply telling demon stories. They were trying to build a moral map of the world, where there is life, family, community, prayer, and law that belongs to the protected side, where there is ruin, uncontrolled desire, loneliness, anonymity, night, and broken boundaries that belongs to Lilith's side. That is why the geography of darkness is in the end also the geography of what human beings have lost. It shows that demons do not appear only in some strange faraway place, but often appear exactly where order has broken down. And perhaps that is what has kept this myth alive for so long. It does not speak only of a female demon out there somewhere, but also of the empty spaces within human life. The places that, if left unguarded, allow darkness to enter all too easily. But the true terror of darkness does not lie in the fact that it hides in distant deserts, but in its astonishing ability to adapt. When the stories of Lilith reached the frontiers of Europe, they did not disappear. Rather, like a great torrent pouring into a vast sea, they merged with the nightmares already living in the minds of the local people. In this land of dense forests and frozen winters, the image of the rebellious woman shed the dust of the desert and clothed herself in a new form, one even more powerful and haunting: the Night Witch transformation in Europe. Demons crossed borders more easily than humans. As Jewish communities spread through Europe, they carried with them stories of Lilith and her daughters. These stories encountered local traditions already crowded with nocturnal spirits and malevolent beings. What emerged was neither purely Jewish nor purely European, but a hybrid that rooted itself in shared fear. The Germanic peoples knew of the mare long before they heard of Lilith. This creature arrived in the darkness and settled itself upon the chests of sleepers, causing breathless terror and paralysis. Victims would awaken, unable to move, feeling a terrible weight pressing downward, sometimes glimpsing a shadowy female form at the edge of their vision. The mare gave its name to the nightmare, a word that survived long after belief in the demon itself had faded. The connection came naturally. The mare's behavior matched almost exactly what Jewish folklore attributed to Lilith's daughters. Both attacked at night. Both targeted the vulnerable sleepers, children, and pregnant women. Both could be driven away with specific talismans and rituals. As populations mixed, the narratives merged. The mare became another face of the Lilith, another expression of the same ancient threat. Slavic lands had their own versions. The Mora in the south, the Mara in the north, and the Zamora in Polish tradition. Each culture shaped the demon somewhat differently. Yet the core remained constant, a female spirit often appearing first as a beautiful woman, and then turning monstrous, slipping through keyholes or cracks in walls, leaving her victims exhausted and terrified. The British Isles contributed the figure of the hag, especially prominent in Scottish and Irish folklore. This was an older woman, withered and powerful, who rode human victims at night as though they were horses. She would braid their hair or the manes of horses in the stable, creating elf locks that brought misfortune. To wake with your hair mysteriously braided in the morning was proof that the hag had visited. This pattern matched Lilith's own transformation in legend, from beautiful maiden to ancient crone. Scandinavia developed perhaps the most detailed taxonomy of these nocturnal spirits. There, the Mara could exist as a separate entity, or as the detached spirit of a living woman, sent out during sleep to torment others. Certain women were believed to be Mara-ridden, without their conscious knowledge, their spirits slipping free while they slept. This aligned with medieval Christian ideas of the witch, whose soul might attend demonic gatherings while her body lay in bed. The physical evidence left behind became central to these beliefs. Victims reported the same symptoms across great distances, and many cultures waking in the night, unable to move pressure on the chest, difficulty breathing visual or auditory hallucinations, and overwhelming fear. Modern medicine identifies this as sleep paralysis, a disruption in the normal transition between sleep states. For centuries, however, it was understood as proof of demonic visitation. Regional variation added local detail. Italian folklore told of the Striga the witch who transformed into an owl or moth to enter homes. She too hunted children and sleeping adults. Romanian tradition described the Moray female vampires, who were in many ways similar to succubi. Greek villages feared the Gelud spirits of women who died in childbirth and returned to steal living babies. Each culture painted the same threat in local colors. The methods of warding off these creatures also developed in similar ways across regions. Iron offered nearly universal protection. An iron nail above the door, scissors under the pillow, a horseshoe over the threshold. The metal's properties were believed to disrupt demonic power. Salt, another substance associated with preservation and purity, served a similar role. Lines of salt across windows and doorways created barriers that nocturnal demons could not cross. Plants offered defense as well. Garlic, already known in Mediterranean and Eastern European tradition as a demon repellent, spread widely. Mugwort, rue vervin, and other bitter or aromatic herbs were bundled and hung in homes. The exact plants varied by region, yet the principle remained the same. Strong scents and substances associated with life and growth could counter beings of death and darkness. Religious symbols gained new force in Christian Europe, where Jewish amulets invoked specific angelic names to bind Lilith. Christian versions called upon saints and the Virgin Mary. The sign of the cross, holy water, and blessed medallions served the same essential purpose as older protective magic, now recast within Christian devotion. The timing of attacks showed remarkable consistency. Nocturnal demons were said to arrive most often between midnight and dawn. They targeted women during menstruation, women during or just after childbirth, and unbaptized infants. They could not enter a home uninvited, but they might be welcomed accidentally through careless words or by leaving doors ajar at the wrong hour. Folk tales preserve these warnings in story form. A beautiful woman appears at twilight, asking to be let in. She seems harmless, even pitiable. Yet those who admit her find their children sick by morning. A man dreams of a lovely maiden. She visits him night after night until he grows pale and weak, aging before his time. A midwife is called to attend a birth in a strange house. She sees through the glamour that the fine ladies present are really monsters, and only a quick prayer saves the mother and child. These stories perform social functions beyond demon defense. They reinforced standards of hospitality and caution, warned against solitary travel, and stressed the importance of ritual protection. They also gave names to experiences that otherwise seemed random or meaningless. When an infant died of what we would now call sudden infant death syndrome, the nocturnal hag supplied an explanation. When a young person wasted away from undiagnosed illness, the succubus received the blame. The legal system sometimes reflected these beliefs. Witch trials across Europe included accusations of nocturnal riding or spirit dispatching. Women accused of witchcraft were questioned about their activities at night, about spirits they commanded, and about whether they had left their bodies while they slept. The assumption was that witches were not merely humans who had made pacts with demons, but might themselves be demons, daughters of an ancient line hidden among human populations. Physical traits became possible signs of demonic heritage. A woman who was too beautiful or too ugly, who had unusual eyes or strange birthmarks, who remained unmarried past the expected age, who never bore children or whose children frequently died, could all be marked as potentially demon-touched. The features that Jewish folklore gave to Lilith's daughters transferred easily onto European women who failed to conform. Yet the folklore preserved something else as well methods of resistance that empowered ordinary people. One did not need a priest or rabbi to protect oneself from nocturnal demons. One could gather herbs personally. One could place iron by the bed. One could speak the right words and make the right signs. This was a form of spiritual warfare open to everyone existing alongside official religious authority. The names changed across languages and across centuries. The rituals varied from region to region. Yet the underlying pattern remained stable for thousands of years. Female nocturnal demons attacked the vulnerable, and people defended themselves through specific customs. The daughters of Lilith wore many faces across Europe, yet remained recognizably her offspring. The romantic reinvention Lilith in 19th century art and literature. Something changed during the 19th century. The demons began to transform under the gaze of poets and painters. Lilith, for thousands of years, the embodiment of terror and threat, became something else entirely beautiful, tragic, and almost sympathetic. Her daughters followed her into this new reimagining. Their monstrous qualities softened into dangerous allure. The Romantic movement saw in Lilith what it valued most: rebellion, passion, and suffering. She had defied authority and paid an eternal price. She was beautiful and terrible, sensual and remote. She embodied the femme fatale before the phrase even existed. For artists trying to push against Victorian restraint while still working inside it, Lilith offered ideal material. Dante Gabriel Rossetti painted her twice each version, capturing a different side of the myth. In Lady Lilith, she sits nude before a mirror, combing her long hair, an image of pure narcissism and sensuality. Her face shows no remorse and no sorrow, only calm self-absorption. Rossetti placed her opposite Mary Magdalene, another subject he painted, where Mary turned from sin toward salvation. Lilith remains forever devoted to her own beauty and power. The poem Rossetti wrote for the painting makes her danger explicit. She remains young while the world grows old, and through contemplation of herself, she draws men into the bright web she can weave, until heart and body and life are caught within it. She is no longer the child thief of folklore, but a seductress who enslaves through beauty itself. Her web traps not infants, but grown men, not their children, but their hearts. Other pre-Raphaelite painters followed this path. John Collier's Lilith shows her as the serpent in Eden, coiled around the tree with a woman's torso and head. Her face holds knowledge and amusement. She appears less evil than dangerous, like a beautiful predator. The moral judgment so central to earlier portrayals begins to fade into aesthetic fascination. Literature followed the same course. George MacDonald's novel, Lilith, published in 1895, created an elaborate fantasy world in which she appears as a complex figure, not simply evil, but wounded and ultimately capable of redemption. She becomes a tragic queen whose cruelty grows out of ancient hurt rather than fixed nature. This was a major shift, the suggestion that the first demon might yet be saved. The daughters of Lilith followed their mother into this new aesthetic, where folklore had cast them as child abductors and bringers of nightmares. Romantic literature recast them as vampires, sirens, and seductive phantoms. They kept their danger, yet gained beauty and even a kind of nobility. They were no longer merely threats to be warded off, but figures of dark fascination. The vampire genre owes much to this shift. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, published in 1872, presents a female vampire who is beautiful, sophisticated, and truly capable of love, even though that love destroys its object. She carries many of the qualities of Lilith's daughters: nocturnal habits, attacks on sleeping victims, a focus on young women, and an ambiguous sexuality. Yet she is also lonely, seeking connection even as she destroys. This reflected changing views of femininity. Victorian society enforced strict expectations for women's behavior, yet remained deeply fascinated by transgressive femininity. Lilith and her daughters came to embody everything: forbidden sexual agency, independence, power, rejection of motherhood, pursuit of knowledge, and resistance to male authority. Artists and writers projected onto these demons their own conflicted feelings about changing gender roles. The symbolist movement pushed this even further. Gustave Moreau painted beautiful, dangerous women drawn from mythology and demonology. His Salome and related works blurred the line between holy and demonic femininity. These figures became aesthetic objects whose moral status mattered less than their visual and symbolic force. Poetry also embraced Lilith. Algernon Charles Swinburne wrote of her as a force of nature, amoral rather than immoral. Robert Browning referred to her in passing as the first Eve, treating the idea as accepted history rather than obscure folklore. The demon was being domesticated, brought into the drawing room through art and verse. Even academic writing began to treat Lilith differently. Early anthropologists and scholars of comparative religion presented her not as a real demon, but as a fascinating artifact of belief systems. She became data, a subject of study, rather than a source of terror. This intellectual distance allowed appreciation of the mythology's power, without requiring belief in its truth. The daughters remained somewhat more frightening in this literature than their mother, while Lilith herself could be portrayed as queenly and dignified. Her descendants often retained more monstrous features. Even here, however, the shift toward sympathy was clear. Where earlier narratives presented them as wholly malevolent, 19th century narratives gave them motives. They had been wronged, or were seeking something, or were suffering within their demonic condition. evil became complex. This reinvention had consequences beyond the artistic sphere. It laid the groundwork for the feminist reclamation that would come in the next century. By making Lilith sympathetic by emphasizing her rebellion and independence, these romantic artists and writers had already begun to question the moral framework that made her a demon. If beauty power and refusal to submit were demonic, what did that suggest about the values of the civilization making that judgment? Sensuality could not be separated from this reinterpretation. Victorian culture was at once prudish and deeply preoccupied with sex. It could not speak openly about desire, so it displaced desire onto demonic figures. Lilith and her daughters became vehicles for expressing the erotic imagination in ways that would have been unacceptable if applied to human women. Paintings showed them nude or nearly nude. Literature described their beauty in lavish detail. Their predatory sexuality became a central feature rather than a shameful secret. This was dangerous material trafficking in ideas that the broader culture officially rejected. Yet it sold paintings and books, drew crowds to exhibitions, and inspired imitation. The demons became profitable. By the end of the century, Lilith occupied a strange double position. She remained in folklore as a figure of terror still invoked in some Jewish communities as a threat to children. Yet she also existed in high art as a symbol of beauty and rebellion, stripped of much of her folkloric context and reframed for aesthetic consumption. These two Liliths existed at the same time, serving different audiences and different purposes. The daughters underwent a similar split. They remained nightmares in children's stories and part of folk custom around childbirth and infant care. Yet they were also becoming vampires in Gothic literature, seductive ghosts in supernatural fiction, and beautiful monsters in decadent poetry. The demon had become an archetype available for creative reinterpretation. This transformation in the 19th century established the pattern for everything that followed in the treatment of Lilith and her daughters. Once the demons had been reimagined as potentially sympathetic as beautiful, rather than only terrifying as complex rather than simply evil, they could never fully return to their original form. The romantic reinvention was irreversible. The daughters in psychoanalysis, Jung, and the archetype of Naamah. The 20th century introduced a new way of understanding demons, not as external beings, but as projections of the human psyche. Sigmund Freud and especially Carl Jung developed frameworks that reinterpreted mythology and demonology as maps of internal psychological territory. Lilith and her daughters found a new home within this landscape. Jung's concept of the anima provided the key bridge. Every man, Jung argued, carries within his unconscious a feminine component, the anima. This part of the psyche includes qualities traditionally coded as feminine emotion, intuition, connection to the unconscious, and the capacity for relationship. The anima appears in dreams and fantasies as different female figures ranging from maternal to erotic. Yet the anima also has a shadow side. When repressed or rejected, it becomes destructive. Jung described this as the terrible mother or the devouring anima. This is where Lilith and her daughters fit almost perfectly. They personify what the terrible mother represents: the feminine that takes instead of gives, that seduces and destroys rather than comforts and creates. The parallels run deep. Lilith's oldest functions, child abduction, sexual predation, and nocturnal terror, align closely with what Jung described as manifestations of the negative anima. When a man fears women when he experiences female sexuality as threatening, rather than inviting, when he cannot integrate the feminine aspects of his own psyche, the anima may appear in dreams as a demon. In another vocabulary, she becomes Lilith. The daughters embody the many forms this threat can take. One demon might be dismissed as an exception, but a host of them, suggests something systematic. A Jungian reading would say they represent the many ways the shadow feminine appears. Agrat as uncontrolled desire, Naamah as deceptive beauty, the unnamed succubi as the fear of intimacy and vulnerability. Freud, while less mystical in approach, offered a related analysis through his work on sexuality and repression. The succubus legend, he might say, grew out of sexual dreams and nocturnal emissions that men could not acknowledge openly. Rather than accept their own sexual nature, especially erotic feelings toward forbidden objects, men projected these desires onto outside demons. The demons became containers for urges the conscious mind could not tolerate. The timing of attacks supports this reading. Demons came at night during sleep when conscious control weakened. They caused dreams that were sexual, yet often mixed with fear. They left physical evidence exhaustion and sometimes emission that demanded explanation. The demon supplied an external cause for internal experience, protecting the ego from confronting its own shadow. Jungian analysts after Jung developed this framework further. Marie-Louise von Franz wrote about the devouring mother archetype and treated Lilith as a major example. James Hillman discussed the terrible goddess in many mythologies and connected her to the dissolution of ego that often accompanies psychological growth. Within this perspective, Lilith's demand that Adam recognize her equality becomes the psyche's demand that consciousness recognize what it has rejected. The child abduction motif also gains new meaning. Children symbolize innocence, potential, and new beginnings. A demon who steals children can represent an inner force that attacks new growth within the self. When a person begins to grow in healthier directions, becoming more open, more creative, more integrated, the shadow may react violently. Lilith, taking the newborn, becomes an image of the psyche resisting transformation, clinging to old patterns, even when those patterns produce suffering. Dreams of being chased or attacked by beautiful women, common across many cultures and eras, become anima encounters in this framework. The dreamer is pursued by aspects of his own psyche that he has rejected or failed to integrate. The attack becomes an attempt at forced recognition. What he refuses to acknowledge consciously returns through dreams and symptoms. Female analysts pointed out that women too can dream of Lilith, though the meaning shifts. For women, Lilith may represent the shadow self, the angry, sexual, independent parts of the personality that society and sometimes the woman herself has judged unacceptable. A woman dreaming of Lilith may be confronting her own denied power. The demon becomes the disowned self demanding recognition. The Jungian framework also helps explain why demon beliefs persist. Archetypes, Jung argued, are inherited patterns of thought built into human psychology. They appear across cultures because they reflect universal human experience. The mother archetype persists because everyone has or once had a mother. Lilith persists because the tensions she embodies are universal and enduring. Modern depth psychology added neuroscience to this picture. Sleep paralysis, the experience behind many visitation stories, results from a temporary disruption in the neural processes that regulate the transition between sleep and waking. During rapid eye movement, sleep, the body enters paralysis so that dreams do not become action. At times, consciousness returns before that paralysis ends. The result is terrifying awake, but unable to move, often accompanied by vivid hallucinations because the dreaming system is still partly active. These hallucinations tend to follow consistent patterns. A presence in the room, a figure on the chest, a sense of threat. Sometimes an explicitly malevolent being. Cross-cultural studies show the same patterns again and again. That suggests the brain, when trapped in this state, generates similar threat images regardless of culture. What changes is the identity assigned to the threat. In one age, Lilith. In another, the mayor. In another, an alien intruder. The underlying experience stays the same. The narrative clothing changes. This biological explanation does not erase the psychological one. It deepens it. The brain has evolved to prioritize threat detection during vulnerable states like sleep. When consciousness returns, in a compromised state, ambiguous stimuli are interpreted as danger. The figure in the corner, the pressure on the chest, the sensed intruder. These may represent the brain's best attempt to explain a frightening internal event. Culture then shapes that raw experience into a specific form. A medieval Christian experiencing sleep paralysis would identify the presence as a demon or incubus. A modern person might identify it as a burglar, or if influenced by those narratives, an alien. The structure of the experience remains stable. The story surrounding it changes. Therapy eventually began drawing on these ideas. Jungian analysis at times used active imagination to work with demon figures appearing in dreams. Rather than trying to banish them, the analyst encouraged the patient to speak with them in imagination, to ask what they wanted to move toward integration rather than rejection. A patient repeatedly dreaming of attack by a female demon might be guided to enter into dialogue with her and ask what part of the self she represented. Critics of psychoanalytic interpretation raised an important warning. The fact that a psychological reading is possible does not mean it exhausts the meaning of a myth. Lilith existed in real religious traditions and shaped real social life for thousands of years before anyone interpreted her as anima projection. The psychological reading is one layer, not the whole. Merely because a psychological interpretation is possible does not mean it exhausts the significance of a mythology. Lilith existed as a figure within actual religious custom with genuine social consequences for thousands of years before anyone thought to interpret her as an anima projection. The psychological interpretation represents one layer, not the entirety. Nevertheless, the impact of Jung's framework proved enormous. It provided a way to take demons seriously without believing in them literally. It preserved the power of the mythology while making it acceptable to modern secular sensibility. Lilith could have significance even if she was not real. Her daughters could threaten even if they represented aspects of ourselves rather than external entities. The feminist reclamation from demon to icon of independence. The 20th century witnessed a dramatic reversal. The demon became a hero, Lilith, for thousands of years. A figure of terror and condemnation transformed into a symbol of female power and independence. Her daughters followed this path, reimagined as women who refused to submit to patriarchal control, rather than as monsters who threatened human children. The groundwork had been laid in the 19th century. But the full reclamation began in the 1960s and 70s alongside second-wave feminism. Scholars and activists rediscovered the alphabet of Ben Sira, noting its central detail. Lilith was created equal to Adam from the same earth. She was not formed from his rib, not created as his helper, but as his partner. Her rebellion was not against God, but against a system that demanded her subordination. This interpretation changed everything. Lilith's refusal to lie beneath Adam during intercourse became not perverse sexuality, but insistence on equality. Her speaking of God's name became not blasphemy, but a claim to power that was already hers. Her departure from Eden became not cowardice, but the strength to choose freedom over comfortable slavery. She became the first woman to say no to patriarchy and to pay the price for that refusal. The demonization of Lilith made perfect sense within this framework. Patriarchal religious systems, the argument went, could not allow her story to be told positively. A woman who rejected male authority, who claimed equality, who preferred freedom to security, threatened the entire social structure. Making her into a demon served as a warning to women against following her example. The message was clear. If you refuse to submit, you will be cast out and turned into a monster. Jewish feminists led much of this work of reclamation. Judith Plaskow's influential essay, The Coming of Lilith, reimagined the first woman as a model. Aviva Cantor-Zukoff wrote about Lilith as the first independent woman. The magazine Lilith, founded in 1976, explicitly took the name to represent Jewish feminist voices challenging traditional interpretations. They reclaimed the demon as their ancestor. The daughters of Lilith also benefited from this reinterpretation. If Lilith herself had been slandered by patriarchy, then her daughters came to represent women throughout history who had refused to conform. Every woman accused of witchcraft, every woman who remained unmarried, every woman who sought knowledge or power or sexual freedom outside accepted limits became one of Lilith's true daughters. Not demonic offspring, but rebels against an unjust system. This framework reinterpreted the accusations themselves. When folklore said Lilith stole children, was that not a projection of male fear that women might place themselves before motherhood? When she was accused of seducing men, was that not a way of blaming women for male desire that men themselves could not control? Child abduction became a symbol of refusal of compulsory motherhood. Seduction became a symbol of ownership of one's own sexuality. Academic feminist theology developed more sophisticated versions of these arguments. Scholars such as Raphael Patai documented Lilith's origins and evolution, showing how the mythology changed in response to different social needs. Others compared Lilith to other suppressed goddess figures and argued for an ancient tradition of powerful female divinity that patriarchal monotheism had systematically demonized. The political implications were direct. If patriarchy could take a figure like Lilith, created equal and demanding justice, and turn her into a demon, what did that reveal about the way power works? It showed that the system maintained itself not only through force, but through narrative. By controlling which stories were told and how they were interpreted, patriarchy shaped reality itself. Reclaiming Lilith thus became a political act, a recovery of narrative power. Writers and artists joined the movement with enthusiasm. Anita Diamant's novel, The Red Tent, featured Lilith as a wise woman wronged by history. Novels, poems, plays, and visual art reimagined the first woman as strong rather than evil, choosing freedom rather than being cast out. Where romantic art had made her beautiful, feminist art made her righteous. The Jewish feminist Seder, an alternative to traditional Passover celebrations, sometimes included a Lilith's cup alongside the traditional Elijah's cup. It represented the female prophet, the woman's voice left out of traditional ritual. Lilith was not a prophet in the strict sense, but she came to symbolize all women written out of religious history, demonized or erased rather than honored. Not everyone within feminism embraced this reclamation without reservation. Some pointed out the difficulty of identifying with a figure whose central mythology included harming children. Even as metaphor, they argued that remained troubling. Others noted that Lilith's story still began from a position of privilege. She was Adam's equal from the start, while Eve was created subordinate. What then of the Eves of the world, who began from inequality? Did they matter less than the Liliths who refused to accept it? There were also concerns about cultural appropriation. Lilith belonged to Jewish tradition, yet she was taken up by non-Jewish feminists who at times stripped away that context. The demon became a universal symbol of female resistance, but in doing so, she also lost part of her particular cultural and religious meaning. Some Jewish feminists welcomed the wider adoption. Others found it unsettling. This reclamation also had to reckon with Lilith's real darkness. In folklore, she was not simply misunderstood. She was presented as genuinely harmful. The stories said she strangled infants, caused miscarriages, and destroyed marriages. Could all of that simply be dismissed as patriarchal slander? Or did the tradition preserve something more complicated? A recognition that female power, like any power, could be destructive as well as creative. Some feminist interpretations found value in that darkness. Yes, Lilith was dangerous, but women's anger can be justified. Women forced into subordinate roles have reasons for rage. The demon could embody righteous fury against injustice. Her violence became not evil, but revolutionary. A destruction that clears the ground so that something new can begin. In that revolutionary reading, the daughters represented every woman who resisted. The woman who refused marriage and was accused of witchcraft. The midwife whose knowledge threatened male physicians. The woman whose beauty and independence made her seem dangerous. The lesbian whose sexuality existed outside male approval. The woman who chose education or career over motherhood. All of these became daughters of Lilith, carrying forward her refusal to yield. Popular culture absorbed these ideas quickly. Young women began naming themselves, or their daughters, Lilith, reclaiming the name from demonic to empowering. Feminist bookstores and spiritual centers used Lilith imagery. Bands, products, and organizations adopted the name, drawing on its associations with strength and independence. The internet age accelerated that spread. Websites, forums, and social media amplified the feminist reading. Memes portrayed Lilith as the first woman who stood up for herself. Blog posts explained her story as the real reason she had been demonized. The narrative became simpler, but also more widely distributed than ever before. Still, complexity remained underneath. Academic feminist scholars continued to wrestle with Lilith's multiple meanings. She could be both victim and victimizer, both wronged and dangerous, both justified in her anger and responsible for her actions. The mythology resisted simple appropriation because it was ancient and layered, shaped across thousands of years and many cultures. The reclamation of Lilith became one of feminism's most striking reinterpretations of traditional material. A figure explicitly labeled evil and demonic turned into a heroine and role model. Her daughters, the nightmares of folklore, became a symbolic sisterhood of resistance. Whether that interpretation recovers the truth of Lilith or creates a new mythology of its own remains debated. Yet its power to inspire and provoke remains undeniable. The pop culture sisterhood. Lilith's daughters in film, television, and games. Modern entertainment media discovered what folklore had always known. Demons make compelling characters. As film, television, and video games became dominant storytelling forms in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Lilith and her daughters spread across screens and pixels. They adapted to the demands of each medium while keeping their core traits. Television found Lilith especially useful. The medium's need for recurring characters and long seasonal arcs fit demon mythology well. In Supernatural, Lilith appears as one of the major antagonists, a powerful demon trying to break the seals that bind Lucifer. She takes different vessels, at times appearing as a young girl, which heightens the contrast between innocent appearance and monstrous essence. The series presents her as commander of demon legions, clearly positioning her as a mother figure to the armies of hell. True Blood took a different route, linking Lilith to vampire mythology. There she becomes not the mother of demons, but the first vampire created by God as punishment, or perhaps as a test. All vampires become her offspring, in a literal sense. Characters worship her, fear her, and eventually must confront her when she rises from ancient sleep. Even the sitcom Frasier offered an unexpected Lilith. Lilith Sternin is not a demon, but Frasier's cold, brilliant ex-wife. Played for comedy, the character still carries several traditional Lilith traits: dominance, intelligence, emotional distance, and a certain predatory force in relationships. She regularly overpowers Fraser through intellectual and emotional superiority. The choice of name was deliberate, drawing on the old associations. Video games embraced Lilith with enthusiasm. The Diablo series features Lilith as the daughter of Mephisto and mother of the Nephilim, a race born from the union of angels and demons. In later entries, she becomes a major antagonist, portrayed with a level of complexity unusual for the genre. She seeks to protect her offspring, even if that means destroying humanity. The game presents her as monstrous and sympathetic at once. Darkstalkers, a fighting game series, includes Morrigan and Lilith as characters tied to succubus mythology, complete with bat wings and sexualized design. They embody the demon woman archetype while functioning as protagonists rather than simple villains. The series draws heavily from succubus tradition, while placing it in a world where demons, humans, and other supernatural beings coexist and clash. The Borderlands series includes multiple characters named Lilith, most notably the Siren in Borderlands 2. She possesses magical abilities, a rebellious temperament, and leadership qualities. Though not explicitly demonic, she carries forward the familiar associations of power, independence, and danger. Film has been subtler, but no less influenced by the tradition. The demon woman who seduces and destroys appears throughout horror cinema, even when she does not bear Lilith's name. Jennifer's Body presents a teenage girl possessed by a demon who seduces and consumes male classmates, essentially a modern succubus story shaped by body horror and sexual threat. The entity dramatizes assault by invisible forces in ways that clearly echo incubus-succubus traditions. Anime and manga produce their own variations. Neon Genesis Evangelion includes Lilith as one of the primal beings whose awakening threatens humanity. High School D, XD, and similar series portray Lilith as the mother of all succubi and an important figure in demon society. These versions filter Western demonology through Japanese aesthetics and storytelling conventions. Comic books offer yet more versions. Mike Carey's Lucifer presents a Lilith who is mother of the Mazikeen. A lineage of demons, she is ancient, powerful, and guided by motives that remain largely opaque. Marvel has used several characters named Lilith, including one cast as mother of all demons and another tied to Dracula's mythology. Young adult fiction discovered Lilith during the urban fantasy boom. Characters descended from Lilith, serving Lilith, or carrying fragments of Lilith appear across many series. These books usually soften her danger while preserving her rebellion and power. She becomes a dark patron figure for teenage girls, dealing with the same struggles over identity and authority that Lilith once faced in Eden. The vampire romance genre owes an indirect but major debt to Lilith mythology. The beautiful, dangerous, nocturnal predator who enters forbidden relationships with mortals is essentially a succubus under a different name. Whether in Twilight, The Vampire Diaries, or countless similar series, the template draws from the same old material that gave rise to Lilith's daughters. Role-playing games, tabletop and digital alike, turned these traditions into systems and mechanics. Dungeons & Dragons has included Lilith-like demons and devils since its early history. Succubi appear as official monster categories with behaviors and abilities drawn straight from folklore. Players can summon them, fight them, or in some games even play them. World of Darkness and related games with modern occult settings place Lilith's offspring at the center. Vampire. The masquerade includes the Bahari, a bloodline that reveres Lilith as the Dark Mother. Demon the Fallen presents Lilith as a powerful entity bound up with the fall of angels. These games invite players to engage the moral ambiguity of demon characters directly. Streaming media accelerated the multiplication of Lilith-inspired figures. Chilling Adventures of Sabrina makes Lilith a major character. Madame Satan, who seeks to become Queen of Hell. She is ambitious, powerful, and ultimately sympathetic despite her demonic role. The show openly references the alphabet of Ben Sira, treating Lilith's story as historical within its fictional universe. American Gods includes Lilith only briefly, yet that appearance signals the continuing force of the mythology. The novel and adaptation treat gods and demons as sustained by human belief. Lilith endures because people keep telling her story. Adult animation has embraced the demon woman archetype as well. Castlevania includes succubi and demon queens drawn from folklore. Hell of a Boss and Has-Been Hotel populate hell with a society of demons, many displaying features associated with Lilith's daughters. These shows mix horror and dark comedy, making demons both threatening and familiar. Across media, the look of Lilith's daughters has become standardized. Dark hair or unnaturally vivid hair, pale skin, revealing clothes that emphasize sexuality, wings bat-like feathered or abstract, claws or long nails, eyes that glow or look distinctly inhuman. The details shift, but the impression stays the same: beautiful, dangerous, otherworldly. This visual language comes from centuries of accumulated imagery. Pre-Raphaelite paintings, romantic poetry, medieval woodcuts, ancient amulets. All of it feeds into the way modern media now imagines these characters. Every new version draws consciously or not on older ones. The result is a layered tradition of demonic imagery. Because of this spread across media, Lilith and her daughters are more widely recognized today than at any point in history. A person who has never read the alphabet of Ben Sira or seen a protective amulet may still know the name Lilith from television games or novels. The demon has entered the mainstream. That familiarity, however, comes with dilution. Lilith becomes flexible, adapted to whatever story needs telling. She can be villain or heroine monster, or misunderstood victim, ancient evil, or modern rebel. The particular religious and cultural contexts fade, while the archetypal elements survive. Lilith becomes a template more than a specific tradition. Her daughters especially become a category rather than distinct individuals. In popular culture, a daughter of Lilith can mean almost any beautiful and dangerous demon woman. The phrase becomes shorthand for a set of traits and story functions. Writers and designers can use the type without engaging the deeper mythology beneath it. That is both loss and transformation. The rich complexity of the older traditions is simplified for mass audiences. But that very simplification also ensures survival. Mythologies preserved only in academic books or small religious communities eventually fade from living culture. Mythologies that enter television and games remain active even when changed. In that sense, the daughters of Lilith have achieved a kind of immortality through popular culture. They appear in new forms every year, reshaped for new media and new audiences. They remain recognizably themselves: nocturnal, beautiful, dangerous, independent, while the details keep changing. The offspring of the first demon thrive in the 21st century. The Lilith within all of us, a modern metaphor for shadow selves. Beyond history and folklore, beyond psychology and feminism, the mythology of Lilith and her daughters speaks to something more immediate. Every person carries aspects of the self that remain hard to accept or integrate. These shadow elements, the parts we reject, deny, or feel ashamed of, often find expression through demon mythology. Consider what Lilith embodies at her core, the parts of ourselves we exile. She begins as Adam's equal, yet becomes cast out when she insists on that equality. She becomes a demon not because of inherent evil, but because of refusal to conform. Her transformation suggests a universal process. When we cannot accept parts of ourselves, we project them outward and label them monstrous. Everyone carries personal Lilith traits, desires, or drives that feel incompatible with the image we want of ourselves. For some, that means anger that feels too intense to admit. For others, sexual desire that conflicts with how they want to be seen. For others, ambition that feels immodest, or selfishness that clashes with cherished beliefs about being a good person. These aspects do not vanish when rejected. They go underground. They reappear in dreams, in sudden outbursts, in repeated patterns we cannot fully control. The daughters multiply that fragmentation. Where Lilith represents the original exile, her daughters represent the many denied aspects that grow from it over time. Every quality we reject, every impulse we cannot integrate becomes another demon child. The inner world fills with these orphaned parts, each carrying a portion of our vitality and energy, each working against conscious intention. Modern therapy recognizes this process through different language. Internal family systems speaks of parts that separate from the core self. Object relations theory describes pieces of the psyche that split off and get projected onto others. Trauma therapy addresses unbearable experiences that fragment the self and resist integration. The language changes, but the phenomenon remains the same. Lilith mythology dramatized it long ago. The fact that Lilith attacks at night fits this understanding closely. Demons come in the dark because that is when conscious control weakens. Shadow material emerges in dreams, in the space between sleep and waking, in the moments when the ego loses its grip. We meet our denied selves when we can no longer sustain the fiction that we are made only of the acceptable parts we prefer to claim. The sexual dimension of many Lilith legends points to one especially charged area of the shadow. My friends, the journey we have just taken was never simply about reopening old case files on a female demon from mythology. Together we have peeled back layers of history, from the deeply disputed original design involving Lilith and Eve to the dark kingdoms of Zamarad and her haunting transformation on the old continent of Europe. When we look back over this entire journey, 3 lessons stand out with a clarity that time has never been able to erase. First, there is the lesson of order and self-will. Lilith represents a primal voice of rebellion, a form of absolute freedom that is missing responsibility and harmony. When the individual self is elevated above all else and rejects every sacred bond, it unintentionally creates an empty space that darkness can fill with ease. The collapse of Plan A is not merely the story of one woman, but a warning about the cost of extreme pride. Second, we see the power of vigilance within marriage and family. Figures such as Naamah or the succubi are not merely demons in dreams. They are the embodiment of temptations, custom tailored to the weaknesses of each human being. In a world filled with distractions and moral values constantly under pressure, faithfulness and sanctity in married life remain the strongest shield. As the Lord taught, the fall begins in the heart long before it becomes action. And finally, there is the lesson of protecting inheritance. The war between the lineage of Eve and the lineage of Lilith is in the end a war between building and dissolution. Protecting children is not only a matter of shielding them from physical danger, but of guarding their souls from being stained by the lingering after effects of hatred and rebellion that have existed since the dawn of time. You can see then that Lilith and her daughters may not stand before us in flesh and blood, yet the empty spaces they represent still remain. They are the empty spaces within loyalty, the cracks in discipline, and the fractures in faith. This myth has endured for so long because it is not truly about some distant being. It is about the spiritual battle taking place each day within every one of us. Vigilance is the only light capable of driving away the shadows of the past. I hope that after this video, you will carry with you a deeper perspective on the order of creation and the value of peace within the soul. Thank you for spending this time with me and walking beside me through this exploration into the mystical realm. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. In the modern world today, what do you believe is the strongest weapon we have to confront the Liliths of this new age? And do not forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you will not miss the next journey of discovery. Goodbye for now, and I look forward to seeing you again in the videos ahead.